Kash Patel reveals Warren's $4.7 trillion scandal, federal court ruling blows away. Her career, the Senate chamber buzzed with quiet tension. Cameras were already rolling, reporters clutched their notepads like weapons. Something was about to happen, everyone could feel it. At the center stood Kash Patel, calm, steady, former prosecutor, former chief investigator for national security. Not a politician, not a performer, a man who had spent his life tracing paper trails through smoke and mirrors. Today, he held a different kind of weapon evidence. Elizabeth Warren sat across the aisle, polished and poised a stack of official reports in front of her. For years, she had led the charge on oversight and funding. But today, the spotlight burned too hot. Today, she would be answering questions. Kash didn't need theatrics. He simply stood and waited for the room to notice. They did. "Before we begin," he said, his voice steady, quiet, lethal, "let me be clear. This is not an audit. This is not a partisan hearing. This is a reckoning." Silence fell hard. He continued walking toward the witness table with a red folder in hand. "We are not here to talk about mistakes. We are here to talk about deliberate decisions, about $4.7 trillion in expenditures that cannot be traced, about billions funneled overseas under banners of compassion, about silence wrapped in official signatures." He placed the folder on the table with a thud. "This is arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't lie." Warren adjusted her mic. "We acted in a time of global crisis," she said, voice level. "Emergency measures were taken to save lives. I stand by those choices." Kash didn't look at her. He opened the folder. $1.5 million to an LGBTQ outreach group in Serbia. He began crisp and detached. $20 million to produce Sesame Street in Iraq. $4.5 million for fighting misinformation in Kazakhstan. A murmur rolled through the room. $7. $9 million. Kash continued flipping a page to teach Sri Lankan journalists not to use binary gender language. Warren leaned forward. "These are human rights initiatives, vetted and approved by regional experts and the U.S. State Department." Kash looked up finally. "And do these same experts account for the $122 million that ended up in organizations linked to Hamas, or the $10 million funneled to al-Qaeda adjacent fronts under the name of food aid?" The room went still. Warren blinked. "Those connections are unverified. Humanitarian work in conflict zones carries risks." "Risks," Kash echoed, "or plausible deniability," a pause. Cameras clicked. "Senator Warren," Kash said slowly, "do you know where $2.7 trillion in Medicare and Medicaid pandemic relief went?" She shifted. "Those records are complex. Emergency disbursements were made under pressure." "But there are no receipts," Kash countered. "No signatures, no trails, just missing funds and press releases." "Seal." Warren opened her binder. "We preserved the American economy. Would you rather we had done nothing? I would rather," Kash said, taking a step closer, "we hadn't looted the American taxpayer and called it compassion." He raised a document. "Here, $711 million sitting in reserve accounts. $825 million requested without congressional approval." The document landed on the table with a soft slap. Deadly. "This isn't speculation," Kash said. "This is arithmetic." Warren exhaled slowly. "You're turning oversight into a witch hunt." Kash smiled for the first time, cold, controlled. "No, Senator. I'm turning silence into a receipt." A beat passed, then another, and the room finally understood this wasn't a debate. This was the beginning of an autopsy. The tension in the Senate hearing room reached a palpable peak. It wasn't just a political debate anymore. What was unfolding was a battle for the very soul of American accountability. The eyes of the nation were on this room, on these leaders. And today they would witness something far more significant than a simple back and forth about budgets. Kash Patel remained unwavering, his eyes locked on Senator Elizabeth Warren. He could see the cracks in her confident facade. She had underestimated the severity of what was coming. As he scanned the documents in front of him, he let the silence stretch out, savoring the discomfort in the room. "Let's move on, Senator Warren." He said, his voice cold but resolute. "Let's talk about that $4.7 trillion, the funds that were dispersed with no paper trail, no receipts, no oversight. I have it right here." He placed the pile of documents on the table, each page a damning testimony to the inefficiencies of the government's spending, each figure a sign of something more sinister. There was no applause. There were no gasps, just the soft clicking of pens and the shuffle of papers. This was not a spectacle of partisan bickering. It was a quiet, merciless truth that was beginning to break through. Warren, once so confident, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She straightened her back, though it didn't seem to improve her composure. Kash, this isn't fair. You're distorting facts. These were emergency measures done in good faith to protect the American people during a global pandemic. We acted swiftly. We did what was necessary to save lives. Save lives, Kash repeated, his tone flat, almost dismissive. You took lives, Senator. You took the American people's hard-earned money and you funneled it into an international slush fund. That's not saving lives. That's laundering a political agenda under the guise of goodwill. The room shifted uncomfortably. Even the stenographer paused, fingers hovering over the keys as if unsure how to record the severity of Kash's words. Warren's face tightened. She opened her binder and flipped through the pages, trying to find a line of defense. But Kash didn't give her the time. You cannot justify these expenditures. You cannot justify spending American taxpayer money without accountability. We're talking about millions, billions, Senator. For Sesame Street in Iraq, for a gender non-binary initiative in Sri Lanka, for building bridges in Yemen. Kash continued, his voice steady and relentless. The camera flashes from the back of the room were now becoming more frequent. The media, ever hungry for the next soundbite, were already sensing the drama unfolding. Warren tried to interrupt. These are humanitarian efforts, Kash. The world is not just America. Our responsibility is global. Kash's gaze hardened. Global responsibility doesn't mean ignoring the needs of the people who put you in office, Senator. If you can justify $20 million for Sesame Street in Iraq, then why do you remain silent on the students in Detroit? Why have you never addressed the needs of the American farmer? He paused, allowing the weight of his question to settle in the air. Warren's mouth opened, then closed. She clenched her jaw, her frustration barely contained. The truth was cutting deeper than she had anticipated. This wasn't just an audit anymore. This was the surgical dissection of her political career. Kash wasn't finished. I think the American people are starting to see what you've been doing. You've been too busy building your international legacy while their streets crumble. You've been too focused on writing checks to foreign governments while the homeless sleep in America's doorways. Your priorities are all wrong, Senator, and the math is starting to add up. Warren tried again to defend herself. I stand by every initiative, every expenditure. Our work abroad has saved countless lives. Countless lives, Kash said, leaning in closer to the table. His voice was razor sharp. You mean countless lives like the ones who were lost in the marketplace attacks in Afghanistan, or the ones in Yemen whose only crime was being born into a war-torn country. If you can call that saving lives, Senator, then I'd hate to see what you consider failure. The room grew deathly silent. Even Warren seemed to shrink under the intensity of Kash's words. But she wasn't going down without a fight. You are twisting my words, Kash. I have dedicated my career to helping those in need. The American people know that. Kash smiled coldly, shaking his head. No, Senator. What you're really doing is protecting your own legacy while the rest of the country suffers. You want the world to think you care. But the numbers, they speak for themselves. He turned the page in his folder. Here's something else. $122 million sent to organizations tied to Hamas. $10 million in food aid that was rerouted to an al-Qaeda affiliate. Can you explain that? Warren's face flushed. Her hand gripped the edge of her binder knuckles white. She opened her mouth to respond, but hesitated, her voice faltering for the first time. Kash didn't let her recover. He pressed on. You want to tell me that wasn't intentional. You want to tell me that was just a mistake. Senator, you knew exactly where this money was going, and you chose to look the other way. Warren's defenses were crumbling, but she still held on. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, the weight of her position pressing down. She wasn't ready to give in. I am not responsible for where aid ends up, Kash, she said, her voice shaking but steadying. I can only trust the systems in place to vet these organizations. Kash leaned forward, his tone now dripping with sarcasm. Trust the systems, the same systems that let $7 trillion go unaccounted for. The same systems that funneled money into terrorist organizations while our own citizens struggle to make ends meet. Warren bristled, her eyes narrowing. I will not sit here and allow you to accuse me of crimes I didn't commit. Kash held up his hand. No one's accusing you of crimes, Senator. What I'm doing is holding you accountable for your actions, and for the actions of the systems you so blindly trust. He turned his attention back to the documents in front of him. I'm not interested in political posturing. I'm interested in the truth. And the truth, Senator Warren, is that you've spent billions of taxpayer dollars with no oversight, no accountability, and no regard for the consequences. Warren's face tightened, but there was nothing she could say. The damning evidence was laid bare. She could no longer deny it. The silence in the room was deafening. Even the most hardened political veterans in the room knew this wasn't a normal hearing. This wasn't just about politics. It was about trust, about corruption, about the failure of the very systems designed to protect the American people. And the truth was finally coming to light. The chamber felt like it was holding its breath. The tension was suffocating, and yet it was clear to everyone present that Kash Patel wasn't finished. The air hummed with anticipation, reporters leaning in closer, cameramen adjusting their lenses. This wasn't just another Senate hearing. This was a reckoning. Elizabeth Warren had been cornered. For all her political finesse, for all the years spent constructing a public persona as a defender of the downtrodden, she was now facing the reality of her actions. Her career, her legacy, was being dissected in real time, and the man doing it wasn't backing down. Warren's face was flushed now, a mixture of anger and fear. Kash had laid out the facts, but now it was time for the final blow. $711 million. Kash said, his voice calm, almost clinical, just sitting in reserve accounts untouched. $825 million in new funding requests filed without congressional approval. He looked at Warren, letting the weight of his words settle. The room was silent, waiting for her to respond. But for a moment she didn't. She couldn't. The numbers were damning. Kash continued flipping through the pages in front of him. This isn't a mistake, Senator. This is a failure of oversight. A failure of leadership. Warren's eyes darted back and forth, looking for an escape, but there was none. She had known the risks when she took on this role, when she assumed the mantle of being the watchdog of taxpayer dollars. But now those very dollars were under a microscope, and the consequences were undeniable. This is a witch hunt, Warren finally said, her voice trembling slightly but still defiant. You're distorting everything I've done. You're cherry-picking data to create a narrative that simply isn't true. Kash shook his head. No, Senator. I'm not creating a narrative. I'm revealing the one you've spent years hiding behind. You can call it a witch hunt, but the truth is you and your colleagues have been siphoning off the American taxpayers' money for decades, and now the bill is due. The media in the room shifted uneasily, scribbling furiously in their notepads, knowing that they were witnessing the collapse of a carefully constructed political persona. Warren leaned forward, her fingers tightening around the edges of her binder. She wasn't ready to concede yet. I have spent my career fighting for the people. I've pushed for more oversight, more accountability. But this is not the way to do it, Kash. You are creating chaos where there needs to be order. Kash didn't flinch. He was ready for this. He'd been preparing for this moment for years. Order, he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. Order would have been ensuring that American funds didn't end up in the hands of groups that fund terrorism. Order would have been making sure that the American people weren't footing the bill for pet projects that only served the elites and their agendas. Warren's face tightened, but she didn't interrupt. Kash was pushing her to a breaking point, and she knew it. Let me make something crystal clear, Kash said, turning the page of his folder. His gaze never left Warren's. This isn't about policy. This isn't even about politics. This is about trust. The American people trusted you, Senator, and you betrayed that trust. The weight of those words hit harder than any other accusation. Warren's deflection tactics were no longer enough. The public was watching. The truth was out, and there was no spinning it back. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her frustration was palpable, but so was the resignation creeping in. She knew deep down that this was the beginning of the end. Meanwhile, Elon Musk sat silently behind Kash Patel, his expression unreadable. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone was enough. He had funded the tools that helped expose the truth, the data, driven revelations, the hard facts that were now on full display. This wasn't just a political fight. This was a battle for transparency, for accountability for the future of the country. Senator Warren, Kash said, his voice cutting through the silence, you've spent your career pointing fingers at the so-called deep state, accusing others of corruption. But today the truth is, you are the one standing in the middle of it. Warren's hands trembled slightly, but she quickly regained control. This is a smear campaign, Kash, a political vendetta. You're using numbers to manipulate the truth. Kash's eyes never wavered. He was done playing games. The numbers speak for themselves, Senator. You can call it a smear campaign, but the American people see through the charade. They see who you really are. The room was silent again. Even the most hardened political insiders could feel the shift. This wasn't about ideology anymore. This was about a system that had been exploited, and it was now facing its reckoning. Kash turned his attention to the stenographer. Record that, please, he said. The truth isn't a smear campaign, Senator. The truth is just the truth, and it's too late to hide from it now. Warren's face went pale, and for a fleeting moment she looked like a woman who had just realized that everything she had built was crumbling before her eyes. Elon Musk stood up, his movements deliberate and slow. He didn't need to say a word. He was the silent partner in this battle, the one who had given Kash Patel the tools to uncover what had been hidden. The battle was far from over, but they had already won one crucial victory. As the room sat in stunned silence, Kash Patel collected his documents, his gaze never leaving Warren's face. He knew this was just the beginning. The real work had only just begun. But for now, they had made their point. They had exposed the truth. And that truth, as ugly as it was, couldn't be denied. Kash Patel's piercing gaze never wavered. Even as he began to walk away from the podium, the weight of his words still hung heavy in the air. He could feel the eyes of every person in that room. The room that had been filled with so much anticipation, so much doubt, now felt almost claustrophobic in its silence. Elizabeth Warren, once the champion of the people, the defender of the oppressed, was standing at the center of the storm. Her reputation, her political identity was crumbling in real time. As Kash sat back down, Elon Musk's silent presence behind him seemed to amplify the severity of the moment. It wasn't just a political fight anymore. It was a full-scale reckoning. The reporters, their pens shaking in their hands, knew they were witnessing something far more profound than a mere public relations battle. This was the collapse of an entire narrative. Warren cleared her throat, but it didn't mask the tremor in her voice. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't anticipated a battle of truth, a battle in which her carefully curated public persona would be put under a microscope. But now there was no turning back. This is outrageous, Warren said, but there was no conviction in her voice. She knew deep down that the game had changed. You have no evidence to back any of this up. You're trying to tear down everything I've worked for with a few cherry-picked facts and figures. Kash leaned forward again, his hands clasped on the table in front of him. He was calm, collected. The adrenaline from earlier had long passed, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had the truth on his side. No, Senator, he said softly, you've been building a false narrative for years. You've been feeding the American people lies wrapped in nice-sounding platitudes. The truth is in the numbers. The American people are paying attention, and they deserve to know what you've done with their money. The room seemed to shrink. Every word Kash spoke cut deeper. Every sentence was another layer peeled away from Warren's carefully constructed defenses. The stenographer's hands were flying across the keyboard, trying to capture every word. The journalists in the back of the room were frantically tweeting their phones, shaking from the intensity of the moment. This wasn't just news. This was history. You can't stand there and tell me that your decisions have been in the best interest of the American people. Senator Kash continued, his tone now steely. You've been siphoning funds meant for our citizens and sending them overseas. You've been masking incompetence with a veneer of moral superiority, and the American people have paid the price. Warren tried to regain control, but she was losing ground. She was beginning to see what Kash Patel had been preparing for. This was not just a political skirmish, it was an assault on her very identity. The defenders of her past policies were nowhere to be seen. The media, the press, the public were all beginning to see her as the villain in this narrative. Kash didn't stop. He had the momentum now, and he wasn't about to let up. Let me remind you, Senator, he said, flipping through the pages of his folder, that we are not talking about small amounts of money. We are talking about billions. You've sent $122 million to Hamas, and you've spent $10 million on food aid that found its way to Al-Qaeda affiliates. The American people deserve an explanation. Warren's face paled further. Her defense was crumbling, and she knew it. Every claim she had made, every statement she had issued in defense of her actions was being torn apart by the unyielding force of truth. These programs are vetted, Warren said, her voice growing weaker. The money is directed where it is needed. Needed, Kash scoffed. Needed by who, Senator? Not by the American people, that's for sure. While they struggle with healthcare, education, and infrastructure, you're handing out their money to groups with ties to terrorism. And you've been doing this for years. His eyes narrowed. How much longer do you think you can keep hiding behind a veil of altruism? Warren opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She had no answers. Nothing that could fix this. Nothing that could undo the damage. The public was turning on her. The silence in the room was deafening. Even the air seemed to thicken. People were no longer watching just to hear what came next. They were waiting for the inevitable collapse. And then, like a surgeon delivering a fatal blow, Kash Patel delivered his final accusation. You've had the power, Senator. The power to change things, to fix the system. But instead, you've used that power to protect yourself and your allies. You've hidden behind your policies, behind your rhetoric, while the American people paid the price. And now the truth is out, and there's no escaping it. Warren blinked, her lip trembling. For the first time since this hearing began, she looked defeated. The pride that had once radiated from her had been replaced with the cold reality of exposure. She was no longer the defender of the people. She was the face of corruption. Kash stood up, his movements deliberate and controlled. He turned to the room, his voice rising just slightly. This hearing is not just about one individual. This is about a system that has failed the American people. A system that has been used to enrich the powerful while ignoring the needs of those who struggle. This is the beginning of the end for that system. Warren could do nothing but sit there defeated. The press cameras clicked furiously, and the reporters scribbled down every word. Kash turned back to face her. Senator, I think the American people have heard enough. With those final words, the battle was over. Warren, once a champion of oversight, was now exposed for what she truly was, a defender of a broken system. Kash Patel's work was far from finished, but the truth had already won the day. The Senate hearing room was quiet, but it was a silence that spoke volumes. The finality of Kash Patel's words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had just been extinguished. The damage had been done. Elizabeth Warren sat at the witness table, her shoulders slumped, her eyes downcast, her once confident demeanor now shattered. The reporters in the room couldn't stop scribbling, their fingers flying over their notepads, capturing every word, every moment. This was history in the making, the unraveling of a political career that had once seemed untouchable. Kash Patel stood tall, his eyes scanning the room. He felt the weight of the moment, but there was no satisfaction in his gaze. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about exposing the truth, a truth that had been hidden for far too long. Beside him, Elon Musk remained silent, his expression unreadable. He had been instrumental in making sure the truth had come to light, but this was Kash's victory. Musk wasn't here to take the spotlight. He was here to back up a man who had spent his career fighting for accountability, and now that fight was reaching its peak. Warren remained frozen at the witness table, staring blankly at her hands. She had been a prominent figure in the fight for oversight and accountability, yet now she found herself on the receiving end of those same principles. The hypocrisy that had once been hidden behind her speeches and legislative battles was now exposed, and there was nowhere for her to hide. The tension in the room was palpable, as if everyone was waiting for her to say something, anything, to salvage what little remained of her reputation. But the longer she sat there in silence, the more it became clear there was nothing left to say. Kash broke the silence. His voice was firm, but there was no anger in it. This isn't personal, Senator. This is about the American people, about their trust. You've spent years in Washington, but at what cost, at whose expense? Warren didn't respond. She didn't need to. The question had been asked, and it hung in the air unanswered. Kash turned to face the rest of the room, his gaze sweeping over the assembled lawmakers, journalists, and aides. The American people have entrusted you with their hard-earned money, and you've failed them. You've betrayed that trust for your own benefit, and now the truth is out. There is no escape from it." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. There was a murmur among the crowd. The truth, as ugly as it was, could no longer be denied. It wasn't just about the missing $4.7 trillion. It wasn't just about the millions spent on questionable foreign aid projects. It was about a system that had been corrupted by those in power, a system that had failed the very people it was meant to serve. And now that system was on trial. Warren's face was pale, her hands shaking slightly as she fidgeted with her papers. She had no more answers, no more defenses. The empire she had spent years building was crumbling before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Kash, however, was not finished. He knew this was just the beginning. The hearing may have ended, but the work ahead was monumental. The public would demand answers. The American people would want to know how this had happened, how their government had allowed this level of corruption to fester. And Kash Patel, with the backing of Elon Musk and others who believed in the fight for accountability, was ready to continue the battle. "This hearing is over," Kash said, his voice resolute, "but the investigation has just begun. The American people deserve answers, and we will make sure they get them." He turned to leave, but not before delivering one final blow. "Senator Warren, the American people trusted you, and you failed them." As Kash exited the room, the press surged forward, microphones and cameras crowding around him. The questions came fast, but Kash didn't answer them. He didn't need to. The truth had already spoken for him. Behind him, Elizabeth Warren remained in her seat, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. She was a political titan who had been brought to her knees by the very principles she had once championed. Her career, once so secure, now seemed like it was hanging by a thread. For Kash Patel, this was just the first step. There was much more work to be done. The system needed to be reformed. The corrupt needed to be held accountable. And most importantly, the American people needed to be restored to a place of trust in their government. But for now, the battle had been won. The elite, those who thought they were untouchable, had been exposed. And that was just the beginning. The news had spread like wildfire. Across the nation, televisions and phones buzzed with updates. A political earthquake had rocked Washington, and Elizabeth Warren's name was at the center of the storm. The aftermath of the hearing wasn't just about the missing funds, the shady foreign aid, or the public revelations about her role in enabling corruption. It was about something much bigger, the erosion of trust in the entire political system. Kash Patel knew this was just the beginning. He had exposed a fraction of the corruption that plagued the halls of power. But the truth was, like a virus spreading rapidly, infecting the public's perception of those they had once trusted. Now it was time to take the fight further. He stood in front of the Capitol building, the cool evening air brushing against his face. Beside him, Elon Musk spoke in his quiet, steady voice. "You did good today, Kash. But this isn't over. You know it as well as I do." Kash nodded, his mind already racing through the next steps. The hearing was only a small piece of the puzzle. The real work would come when they took this fight to the next level. There were still powerful forces in Washington who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. But Kash wasn't backing down. "The investigation has to continue," Kash said, his eyes steely. "We have to push for transparency at every level. There are still too many layers of this system that haven't been touched. Warren is just one piece of the puzzle." Elon glanced at him, his usual calm demeanor hiding a hint of determination. "And the American people. They'll be with us," Kash replied. "We've already seen their response. They want accountability. They want change. And that's what we're going to give them." The next few days were a blur of meetings, briefings, and press conferences. Kash and Elon had quickly assembled a coalition of lawmakers, watchdog groups, and media outlets that were determined to continue the investigation. The American public, energized by the revelations from the hearing, was now demanding that the rest of the truth come to light. But there were still many obstacles in their path. Powerful members of Congress, allies of Warren, were already working behind the scenes to bury the investigation, to spin the narrative in a way that would protect the system. Kash wasn't going to let that happen. He spent hours sifting through more documents, more financial reports, more testimony. He and his team of investigators began uncovering even more damning evidence connections between top political figures and shadowy financial networks, money laundering schemes that funneled taxpayer dollars into private hands, and a system that had been rigged to benefit the elite while leaving ordinary Americans to suffer. The media couldn't ignore it. The news cycle was relentless, and the stories of corruption continued to dominate the headlines. Warren tried to defend herself in interviews, but the damage was done. She was no longer a trusted figure. Her words fell flat. The American people weren't listening anymore. Kash, however, was just getting started. He called for a second hearing, one that would bring in more witnesses, more evidence, and more accountability. He knew the pressure was building, and he was ready to face it head on. The next hearing was set for a week later, and Kash had already made his plans. This time, it wasn't just about Elizabeth Warren, it was about the system. It was about every politician, every bureaucrat, and every corrupt official who had taken advantage of the American people. As the day of the hearing approached, Kash found himself reflecting on everything that had brought him to this point. He had spent his career fighting for accountability, for transparency, and for justice. But this fight was different. This was personal. This was about exposing the very foundations of power that had been built on the backs of those who had no voice. When the day finally came, Kash entered the hearing room with a sense of calm determination. There was no more room for compromise, no more time for political games. It was time to bring the full weight of the truth to bear. He stepped up to the podium, his eyes scanning the room. The media was there, the cameras were rolling, and the American people were watching. Today, we continue our fight for the truth. Kash began, his voice steady and firm. We have exposed the corruption that has taken root in our government. We have shown the American people how their trust has been betrayed, but the work is far from over. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. The room was silent. Every eye was on him. We have seen the consequences of unchecked power, Kash continued. We have seen the devastation it has caused. But we will not rest until we hold those responsible accountable. We will not stop until the system is reformed, until the American people get the government they deserve. The room erupted in applause. It wasn't just the lawmakers who were applauding. It was the people in the gallery, the reporters, the citizens watching at home. They were all standing behind Kash Patel. They were all standing behind the truth. And that Kash knew was just the beginning. Here's the next story. Caroline Leavitt shuts down Jimmy Kimmel's liberal lies. Final argument leaves him speechless. The studio lights were bright, casting a cold glow on the set. In front of the cameras, Caroline Leavitt adjusted her microphone, her face hardening into a practiced mask of calm confidence. She was here to defend Donald Trump, her boss, her leader, a man who had defied all odds and reshaped the political landscape. On the opposite side of the stage, Jimmy Kimmel sat behind a sleek desk, wearing his usual sarcastic grin, ready for another round of cutting humor. This wasn't just another late-night comedy show. This was an arena where political ideas collided. And tonight it would be no different. Welcome back to Jimmy Kimmel Live. Kimmel started his voice laced with the usual mockery. Tonight we've got Caroline Leavitt, one of Trump's most outspoken defenders. Let's see if she can explain why the art of the deal is costing us billions and making every country hate us. Caroline's lips curled into a tight smile as the applause from the live audience died down. This was the part of her job she loathed most, the mockery, the jabs, the constant undermining of everything she stood for. But tonight she wasn't just going to take it. Tonight she was going to turn the tables. Thanks for having me, Jimmy, she said, her voice steady but sharp. I'm here to talk about something that's actually affecting real Americans. While you're out there making jokes, people in the heartland are struggling and they want solutions. Kimmel's grin widened. Oh, I'm sure they're really concerned about tariffs and border security while they're watching Netflix and eating avocado toast. The audience laughed, and Caroline could feel the heat of their eyes on her, sensing the wave of mockery rolling toward her. But she held her ground, her posture perfect, her eyes never wavering from Kimmel. You can laugh all you want, Jimmy Caroline continued, her tone cool and composed. But the reality is President Trump has been doing more for the American people than any of your Hollywood elites ever will. The world might not like it, but they need us. You might find it funny, but countries are scrambling to make deals with the U.S. because we hold the power, and we don't back down. Kimmel leaned forward, his fingers drumming on the desk. Oh, please. Let's not pretend Trump's trade wars didn't make things worse. You don't just get to slap tariffs on China and think the world's going to say thank you for that. Tariffs are a tool. Caroline shot back, her voice steady but rising in intensity. They're not just a punishment, they're leverage. The same leverage you'd use if you were trying to negotiate with a stubborn partner. And it's working. The world's starting to realize they can't just ignore us. Kimmel let out an exaggerated sigh. Well, if we're talking about leverage, maybe we should discuss how you're trying to leverage the American people's patience, huh? $6 trillion lost in 1 week. Yeah, that's some great leverage you've got there. Caroline felt the rush of irritation flood through her, but she kept her expression neutral. She knew this was coming. She was prepared for it. 6 trillion, she scoffed. That's the kind of misinformation you peddle. It's not the numbers that matter, it's the long-term goals. Trump's plan isn't just about temporary wins. He's playing a game that requires vision, not just immediate results. Vision. Kimmel raised an eyebrow. Is that what you call it? Because I call it a crash course in how to turn an economy upside down while blaming everyone else. The audience roared with laughter again, but Caroline remained unfazed. She wasn't here to entertain. She was here to win, to show that the world had misunderstood Trump's strategy. She could feel her own heartbeat quickening, but her face stayed impassive, her voice measured. Look at the facts, she said, leaning forward slightly. Under Trump, unemployment was at its lowest in decades. Wages were rising, jobs were coming back. All the while, the world was benefiting from our economy, even if they didn't want to admit it. Kimmel scoffed. Right. Making America great again by making the rest of the world hate us. A perfect plan. Or maybe you'd call it the art of the deal. Caroline narrowed her eyes, her jaw tight. The jabs were relentless, but she wasn't going to back down. It's easy to mock success, Jimmy. It's easy to throw stones from a comfortable position. But out there in the real world, people are waking up. They're realizing that we need to stand up for ourselves. And guess what? The world is waking up to it too. Oh, I'm sure they are, Kimmel replied sarcastically. Because who wouldn't want to sign a trade deal with a country that's alienating its allies and turning everyone against us? The tension in the room was palpable now. Caroline could feel the sting of Kimmel's words, but she wouldn't let him win. Not here, not tonight. She had come for a reason. She wasn't just another talking head. She was here to challenge the narrative. Let me tell you something, Jimmy, Caroline said, her voice low and cutting through the laughter that had just died down. The world doesn't get to decide who leads. The American people do. And they chose Trump. He wasn't elected to be popular. He was elected to get things done. And no matter how much you try to tear him down, no matter how much you mock him, the results speak for themselves. Kimmel sat back in his chair, a skeptical smirk tugging at his lips. Yeah, results, huh? Well, when the results are more tariffs, more trade wars, and a $6 trillion loss, maybe it's time to rethink the plan. That's where you're wrong, Caroline snapped. You keep focusing on the short-term losses, but you're missing the bigger picture. And the world will come to terms with Trump's vision just as they always do. They can either adapt or get left behind. Kimmel shook his head, clearly amused. Oh, I'm sure they will. I mean, who wouldn't want to follow the man who thought tariffs were a game of bingo? Caroline let out a sharp breath. She knew this wasn't going to be an easy battle, but it was one she was willing to fight. For too long, people like Kimmel had ridiculed Trump and everything he stood for. But she wouldn't let them diminish the accomplishments of a man who had changed the course of history. The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing the determination in her eyes as she stared at Kimmel. This was more than just a TV appearance. This was a battle for the soul of the nation. The show continued, but for Caroline it was clear this was only the beginning. The war of words had only just started and the stakes were higher than ever. The heat in the studio seemed to intensify the atmosphere, thick with an unspoken challenge. Caroline Levitt leaned forward, the lights overhead casting long shadows on her face, sharpening her features as if to punctuate her every word. She could feel the weight of Kimmel's mocking gaze, but she was done playing defense. Now it was time to play offense. Let's get something straight, Jimmy, she said, her voice low but brimming with conviction. This isn't about a game of bingo or making jokes about tariffs. This is about the future of America. It's about ensuring that we remain a global power. And yes, sometimes tough decisions need to be made, but that's what Trump does. He makes the tough calls. Kimmel raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Tough calls. You mean making enemies of everyone from Canada to China tough? Seems like a pretty nice way of saying reckless. Don't you think? Caroline's eyes narrowed, her posture rigid as steel. She wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. "I'm not here to explain policy to someone who doesn't understand it," she snapped. "You want to talk about reckless? Let's talk about the Obama administration. Let's talk about how they left our borders open, how they let illegal immigration run rampant, and how they never once asked the hard questions about who's coming into this country." The crowd was quiet now, the weight of Caroline's words hanging in the air like an electric charge. Kimmel, however, wasn't backing down. He smirked, eyes gleaming with that familiar Hollywood arrogance. "Oh, so now you're going to play the blame Obama card, real mature. The man's been out of office for years, and you're still clutching at his shadow to defend your boss's mess." Caroline's chest tightened, but she controlled her breathing. "Don't you dare tell me what's mature and what isn't, Jimmy. This is about more than just pointing fingers. It's about a new direction, a new vision. A vision where America leads, not just follows the whims of foreign powers or bends the knee to trade deals that hurt our own people." Kimmel laughed lightly, shaking his head. "You keep talking about America first, but let's not pretend that's anything more than a slogan. The reality is the world is laughing at us. You want to talk about leadership. Try telling that to our allies in Europe or to Mexico or to the rest of the world who can't figure out whether we're friends or foes." The audience chuckled, some nodding in agreement, but Caroline could sense a shift. The show was designed to put her on the defensive, to make her feel small, to make her feel like the odd one out. But Caroline wasn't the one who needed to be defensive. She had the truth on her side. "They're laughing, Jimmy," Caroline said, her voice cutting through the laughter like a knife. "But the truth is they're scared. They're scared because Trump doesn't play by their rules. He's not afraid to push back. And that's something the world hasn't seen in decades. That's why countries are scrambling to make deals with us, because we're no longer the ones begging for scraps. We're the ones holding the cards." Kimmel chuckled, though there was an edge to it now. "Is that what you think, that the world is scrambling to deal with Trump, or is it just that no one wants to get stuck in his trade wars? He's been burning bridges faster than a forest fire. At this rate, you'll be left with a lot of empty calls and no one to answer." Caroline leaned forward, her gaze never leaving his. The audience was silent, sensing the tension building between them. "You can call it a trade war all you want, Jimmy, but the truth is simple. For too long, the U.S. has been getting the short end of the stick. We've been losing jobs, losing factories, losing respect. But now we're making them respect us. We're showing the world that we're not a punching bag. And if that means shaking things up, then so be it." Kimmel's grin faltered for a moment, and Caroline could see the cracks in his armor. The laughter, the mockery, it was all starting to feel hollow. And she wasn't done yet. "You want to talk about losing?" she asked, her voice rising in intensity. "Because right now, the only ones losing are the American people. The ones stuck paying the price for endless wars, endless debt, and endless promises that never get fulfilled. While we're over here trying to fix things, trying to make real change, you and your friends in Hollywood just sit back and laugh. You think it's all a joke? Well, maybe it's time you woke up." Kimmel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The tone had changed and he knew it. Caroline had taken control of the narrative. For the first time in the show, the crowd was quieter. Kimmel's usual sharp retorts were nowhere to be found. He didn't have an immediate comeback. "You're telling me to wake up," Kimmel finally managed, but there was no conviction behind his words. "It's you who needs to wake up, Caroline. The world doesn't revolve around Trump's ego. We're talking about people's livelihoods here, people who are suffering because of these reckless decisions. You can't keep spinning this as a victory for America when it's costing the world so much." Caroline stared at him, her face unreadable. "The only ones suffering are the people who don't understand what's really happening. You want to blame Trump, but the truth is that he's doing exactly what he promised. He's draining the swamp, he's challenging the status quo, and he's putting America first. So yeah, people are going to be uncomfortable, but that's a small price to pay for real change." There was a beat of silence, a tension in the air so thick that you could almost cut it with a knife. Kimmel, for the first time in the interview, seemed to lose his footing, his usual smirk replaced by a flicker of doubt. Caroline had made her point. The cameras caught every moment and the audience felt the shift. Caroline wasn't the only one playing in this game. She was dominating it. "You keep saying America first," Kimmel said, finally, though his voice was more cautious now. "But what about the rest of the world, Caroline? What about the people who are being crushed under these policies?" Caroline stood tall, her answer unwavering, sharp like a scalpel. America comes first, Jimmy, because when we're strong, the world is stronger. And that's something no one can deny. The applause was a mix of uneasy claps and forced applause from the crowd, but Caroline didn't care. She wasn't here to make friends, she was here to make a point. As the segment drew to a close, the tension in the studio didn't subside. The war of words wasn't over. It was just beginning. The cameras buzzed, the bright studio lights flickering slightly above them. The moment was palpable, an undeniable tension crackling between Caroline and Jimmy. The usual playful banter had been replaced by a palpable fight for control. Caroline could feel the weight of every word, every eye watching her. This was no longer a game, this was about defending her values and everything she stood for. Kimmel, though, still maintaining his charm, was visibly rattled. His words were coming quicker, but they lacked the usual bite. Caroline had unsettled him. "Look, Caroline," he started, leaning into the microphone, the smile on his face, more of a mask than genuine humor. "You keep talking about putting America first, but you ignore one critical thing. Trump's decisions aren't just hurting the other guys, they're hurting American families. Tariffs, trade wars, sanctions. It's not just abstract policies, it's jobs, it's healthcare, it's the livelihoods of people in places like Detroit and Akron, and they're being crushed under the weight of it all." Caroline's gaze didn't waver. She stood taller, almost as if feeding off the challenge he presented. "You think those families don't understand the stakes, Jimmy," she shot back. "They know better than anyone what it's like to see factories leave, to watch their communities wither because of bad deals and weak leadership. That's the real cost of business as usual in Washington, and that's what Trump is fixing." "But at what cost?" Kimmel retorted sharply. "You're talking about making America great again, but every time Trump makes a decision, every time he pulls that tweet trigger or announces a new policy, people suffer. Not just the other guys, but Americans." Caroline was on the edge now. She didn't need to raise her voice, but her words hit like a punch. "That is exactly what you're missing, Jimmy," she said, the frustration now creeping into her tone. "The problem isn't the policies themselves, it's that we've been feeding off these bad deals for decades. We've been giving away our power. You think China, Russia, Europe, they don't have their own agendas. They've been using us for years. They've been laughing behind our backs while we've been playing nice in the name of diplomacy. Trump is standing up for us, for America." Kimmel raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair, still trying to regain his composure. "So, you think just slapping tariffs on everyone and alienating our allies is the solution? That's your plan. Start a global fight with every country on the planet." Caroline's eyes narrowed. She wasn't going to back down now. "You think diplomacy has worked so well over the last few decades? We've been ignored, laughed at, while others took advantage of us. These tariffs, they're not about starting a fight, Jimmy. They're about leveling the playing field. For too long, America's been paying the price for everyone else's greed." Kimmel scoffed, trying to brush her off, but the audience was feeling the shift. They had sensed her quiet strength, the kind that doesn't flinch when the spotlight is on them. "You're speaking in broad terms, Caroline," he said, voice more defensive now, "but you haven't answered my question. What about the real people, the ones who lose their jobs when companies can't afford those tariffs? What about the families who can't pay their bills because of this America First mentality?" "Let's talk about those families," Jimmy. Caroline countered, her voice cold, but undeniably firm. "Because those families are the ones who've been ignored. Those are the ones who were told to sit back and let the government run the show. They've been fed a steady stream of false promises by politicians who never had to worry about a paycheck or a job. You want to talk about people losing their jobs? Try talking to the worker in Ohio who watched their factory shut down while we let China dump cheap goods into our markets, or the farmer in the Midwest who's watched their livelihoods erode thanks to trade deals that benefited everyone but them." Her words hung in the air, a stark contrast to Kimmel's earlier mockery. She wasn't just defending Trump anymore, she was defending the American people, the ones who felt forgotten and abandoned by the very system Kimmel seemed to champion. The tension thickened, the clash of ideologies becoming undeniable. Jimmy, once quick with his jabs, now found himself on the back foot, his rehearsed lines faltering. "Caroline, you can't just keep pointing fingers at China or Obama or whatever scapegoat suits you," Kimmel said, his voice tight. "You need to understand that these decisions have consequences here in our own backyards. This isn't about leveling the playing field. This is about dragging us all into a mess of our own making." Caroline leaned in her voice, dropping to a near whisper. No, Jimmy. This is about protecting us from that mess. Trump may not be perfect, but he's doing something none of your precious career politicians have had the guts to do. He's standing up to the world, and he's standing up for America. The room seemed to hold its breath. The crowd, once divided, was now sensing something more than a typical political argument. This wasn't just about Trump. This was about the future of America itself. And Caroline had become the voice of the forgotten, of the people who were tired of watching their country get walked all over. Kimmel shifted uncomfortably, but there was no denying it. Caroline had the upper hand now. I think we've heard enough of your America First rhetoric, Kimmel said, finally trying to regain control of the narrative. It's time to bring this back to reality. No, Caroline said, her voice firm. It's time you see the reality for what it is. You can keep pretending like the world isn't watching, but the truth is, Jimmy America is watching. And we're done being told to sit back and wait for things to change. The applause from the audience was subdued but significant. Caroline had done what no one expected. She had pushed back against the narrative that was being built around her. She hadn't just responded to Kimmel's attacks, she had flipped the conversation, bringing it back to the very core of the issue. The stakes were higher now, and the conflict between them was no longer just about Trump's policies. It was about who held the power, the people, or those who sat in ivory towers and dictated from above. Jimmy Kimmel didn't have a snarky retort this time. He was left to process the weight of her words. The game had changed. The battle was far from over, but Caroline Leavitt had made her stand, and it was clear she wasn't backing down. The audience had gone quiet, a palpable silence hanging in the air. Caroline had landed her punch, but now the room was poised for the next move, the next salvo in this ideological battle. Kimmel, once so sure of himself, was visibly taken aback. His usually sharp comebacks were now lost in the weight of her words. The shift had been subtle but undeniable. Caroline had gone from the fiery defender of Trump to a voice for the disenfranchised, and Kimmel had nowhere left to hide. He leaned back in his chair, trying to collect himself, but the moment was slipping from his grasp. The smug grin he wore had faded, replaced by an expression of uncertainty. All right, Caroline, let's slow down here. He said, his voice strained, trying to regain his footing. You can't just throw around America First like it's the magic solution to all our problems. It's not that simple. Caroline didn't flinch. She hadn't even broken a sweat. I'm not throwing it around Jimmy, I'm living it. And maybe that's the problem here. You think America First is a slogan, but it's not. It's a lifeline for the people who've been ignored, the ones who were left to deal with the fallout of failed policies for decades. While people like you are cozy in your studios, the rest of the country has been fighting for their place in the world. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in, eyes locking with his. The problem is you're scared. You're scared that the system that's worked for you, that's catered to your worldview, is crumbling. And I get it. No one likes to see their comfortable little world fall apart. But that's what's happening. That's what Trump represents, the shaking of that foundation. Kimmel's jaw clenched. This wasn't going as he expected. You think this is about comfort? About me, he shot back, voice rising slightly. I'm not the one shaking things up. For fun, Caroline. People are hurting. Real people. Families. And when Trump makes these decisions, they feel it in their wallets, in their health care, in their lives. You're ignoring the reality that those policies have consequences. Caroline's eyes narrowed, her tone turning steely. And you're ignoring the reality that for years, the people who work hardest, who pay their taxes, who support this country with their sweat, have been getting screwed. And that is what people like you don't get. You can't see past your own bubble. You think the world is this neat, orderly place where everyone plays fair. But out there in the real world, people are losing jobs, their homes, their dignity. Kimmel's smirk faltered. The cameras flickered in the background as the energy shifted. The audience was starting to lean in, some nodding, as Caroline spoke. She wasn't just defending Trump. She was giving voice to a frustration that many felt but had never been able to articulate in front of such a massive audience. You know, it's easy to sit back and critique when you've never had to worry about your next meal or your job security, she continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. But let me tell you, Jimmy, there are millions of Americans right now who are looking for someone who will fight for them, who will stop apologizing for being American and start fixing the damn problems that have been building for decades. Trump didn't create these problems, Jimmy. He's just the one finally trying to fix them. Kimmel opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off. The fire in her eyes was impossible to ignore. You want to talk about consequences. The consequence of doing nothing for so long is the situation we're in now. The working class, the people who make this country run, have been abandoned by politicians from both parties. So no, I don't care if people like you feel uncomfortable, it's time to shake things up. And if that means standing up to the rest of the world, so be it. The silence in the studio stretched again, but this time it wasn't a breathless pause, it was a recognition. The audience, the crew, everyone in that room could feel the shift. Caroline wasn't just a political pundit anymore. She was the voice of a movement, a reflection of the people who felt unheard. And now, for the first time in the debate, Kimmel seemed lost for words. He stammered, looking for a way to reassert control, but the sharpness of Caroline's words had cut through his defenses. This wasn't just a debate about Trump's policies anymore. This was a battle of ideologies, of values. And Caroline had made it clear she wasn't backing down. "Fine, Caroline," Kimmel said, his voice wavering slightly. "You want to keep defending this chaos. Fine, but mark my words, the world won't be so kind to the idea of America first when it burns all its bridges." Caroline gave him a sharp smile, her eyes unwavering. "You keep thinking that, Jimmy. Because in the end, it's not about who has the loudest voice, it's about who's fighting for the right cause. And right now, that's Trump." With that, she stood tall, her final words echoing in the air like a declaration. "And I'm not done yet." The room was still. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Caroline had said what everyone was thinking, and for the first time it seemed like the narrative had shifted. She was no longer just a politician or a pundit. She was a symbol for a movement that wasn't afraid to face the hard truths. The audience remained silent, but there was no mistaking the shift in the air. The game had changed, and Caroline had claimed the high ground. The atmosphere in the studio was electric. Caroline Leavitt had just delivered her most cutting direct speech, yet leaving Jimmy Kimmel and the entire crew speechless. She hadn't just been defending Trump, she had brought the audience into a raw, unfiltered truth about America's struggles. And now the inevitable confrontation was about to unfold. Kimmel was rattled, but his instincts as a host kicked in. He leaned forward, trying to regain control, though the force of Caroline's words still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. "Caroline," he began, forcing a grin, "you're throwing a lot of blame around, but who exactly do you think is responsible for all of this Trump? The people who voted for him. This country's entire political system didn't break overnight." Caroline didn't flinch. She met his gaze, calm and unwavering. "The system didn't break overnight, Jimmy. It's been broken for decades. The elites in Washington, the people you run with, have been running this country into the ground. Trump might be controversial, but he's doing something that no one else had the guts to do. He's challenging the people who've been profiting from the pain of ordinary Americans." Kimmel shook his head, his frustration starting to show. "So now we're blaming the elites, huh? What about the people who are hurting from these so-called policies? The farmers in Iowa, the families who are losing health care, the teachers who can't get the funding they need for their schools?" His voice raised slightly in an attempt to reclaim the moral high ground. Caroline shot back, her tone ice cold. "Let me make this very clear, Jimmy. You think Trump's policies are the problem? No. The problem is that people like you don't see the everyday struggles of Americans. You're sitting behind your fancy set, throwing around theories, but you don't understand what it's like to have your family's future be dictated by corrupt politicians who don't care about you." She paused, letting the words sink in. Trump is the first president to fight for these people. The ones who are working 2 jobs, the ones who are still waiting for their shovel-ready jobs to arrive, the ones who don't have the luxury to be outraged by the so-called chaos because they're living it every single day. Kimmel opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. The studio lights seemed to grow hotter, the silence in the room deafening. For the first time in the entire debate, Kimmel was visibly rattled. His prepared lines felt hollow, like they couldn't stand up to Caroline's unapologetic stance. "You're acting like Trump's chaos is just noise." "Jimmy," Caroline continued, her voice firm, "but when the dust settles, you'll see he's the one who is actually listening to the people who have been silenced for too long. And when that happens, you'll be the one left scrambling for an apology." There was no dramatic pause this time. Kimmel was speechless, his expression blank. Caroline had struck a blow that even he couldn't deflect. The finality in the air was heavy. The studio was still, as if the audience was collectively holding their breath. Kimmel's final retort was gone, swallowed by the weight of the moment. Caroline had said what needed to be said. The lines had been drawn. And as she stood there, poised and unwavering, it was clear that the tide was turning. The spotlight was on her now, and there was no going back. The debate was no longer just about Trump. It was about an entire movement that refused to be ignored. The room was electric, almost suffocating with tension. Caroline Leavitt stood unshaken as the cameras focused on her. Kimmel, now visibly sweating, realized he had underestimated her. He had expected a political argument, but what Caroline delivered was a battle cry for the forgotten middle class. Kimmel took a deep breath, trying to regain some semblance of control. So you're saying Trump's chaos is a necessary evil, that his unpredictability is somehow saving America? Caroline's eyes narrowed, her voice steady. Trump isn't chaos, Jimmy. He's the mirror the elites are too afraid to look into. He's everything they hate, unpolished, raw, and willing to call out their corruption. And let me tell you, it's working. The audience shifted, their murmurs growing louder. Caroline's words had taken root, and now they were listening intently. Kimmel, on his last legs, tried one final shot. And you really think people like you, Han, using Trump's name, are going to fix this country? Caroline's response was simple, but it hit with the force of a freight train. I'm not using Trump's name, Jimmy. I'm standing for the people who've been used by you and the system you defend. You've failed them for decades, and now it's time someone held you accountable. The lights above flickered as if the studio itself was reacting. Kimmel, beaten, stood motionless for a moment. The debate had ended. Caroline had won not with theatrics, but with undeniable truth. Here's the next story. Democrat panic mode. Pam Bondi just ends. Letitia James Homan blows her career. She's done. The sun was high above Newark, but inside the Delaney Ice Detention Center, the air was thick with unease. A line had been crossed, not by migrants or agents, but by the very people who swore to uphold the law. Tom Homan stood in the Department of Homeland Security's operations room, arms folded, eyes locked on the live feed. Cameras zoomed in on a protest forming outside the facility. What started as chants and colorful signs was turning into something else, something calculated. "Sir, they're crossing the perimeter," a junior analyst called out. Tom didn't blink. He watched Raz J. Baraka, mayor of Newark, approach the fencing. Behind him, a small but vocal crowd cheered. L. Monica Masiver, a congresswoman with a flair for performance, held up her phone, streaming it all. "Keep it on me," Baraka said to the camera crew. "I want America to see what defiance looks like." "Ma'am," an ICE officer warned Masiver. "This is federal property. You need to step back." "What?" Masiver didn't just ignore him. She shoved the officer with both hands. Then came the handbag. A heavy swing struck his chest. Gasps from the crowd. Phones up. Hashtags ready. Tom Homan stepped forward. Strike one. Within minutes, Baraka had torn up a formal federal warning and thrown it in the grass. He stared directly into a DHS drone camera and declared, "This land belongs to Newark, not the dogs of Trump." That was the second violation. The third came when he led the crowd through the open gates. Back in Washington, Attorney General Pam Bondi raised her eyes from a folder. "Do it by the book." Tom said, his voice low, "But do it hard." Across the country, U.S. Marshals were already assembling. At 3:14 p.m., under the flashing heat of Newark's sun, the gates opened again, this time not for protesters. Marshals moved swiftly. Alina Habba, the lead federal prosecutor on scene, walked in behind them. "Mayor Baraka," one marshal said, cuffs in hand, "you're under arrest for criminal trespassing, federal obstruction, and interference with immigration enforcement." Baraka blinked, then smirked. "You're arresting a sitting mayor," Alina stepped in. "No," she said. "We're arresting a man who thought he was untouchable," Masiver shouted into her live stream. "This is political theater." Alina didn't flinch. "Take them both." In the DHS control room, Tom Homan turned to the room. "If they walk onto federal ground without permission," he said, "they don't walk out without consequences." The silence that followed wasn't surprise. It was a verdict. But this was only the beginning. Back in Washington, the footage went viral. 3 camera angles. One direct hit. Baraka in cuffs stomped on a congressional subpoena and screamed into the lens, "If Trump thinks he can crush my city with ice, he'll have to bury it with me." Tom Homan watched it play on loop. "Get me Mike Johnson," he said. The call went through in 30 seconds. "You saw it?" Tom asked. Everyone saw it, Johnson replied. We need a hearing, Tom said. Not next week, not after recess. Now. On what grounds? Tom's voice dropped to steel. A sitting mayor declared open rebellion against the United States government on camera. Pause. Done. By sunrise the next day, room 226 of the Rayburn House Office building was being prepped for emergency congressional testimony. Outside reporters swarmed. Inside subpoenas were issued. Tom didn't want spectacle. He wanted justice. The Capitol buzzed with a pulse not felt since the impeachment days. Reporters clustered like bees around room 226 of the Rayburn House Office building. Security doubled. Phones off. Cameras everywhere. Inside, Tom Homan stood at the center of the storm. He wasn't a senator or a judge. He was the man whose name had become synonymous with border enforcement. And now his war was coming home. Pam Bondi entered the chamber in silence, her steps deliberate. She carried a leather folder embossed with the seal of the Department of Justice. Eyes locked with Homan's. No words, just understanding. Across the city, another name surfaced, Letitia James, subpoenaed. The grand jury demanded answers for her alleged shielding of immigration offenders and refusal to honor ICE detainers. Tom had predicted it. She turned prosecutorial discretion into a political weapon, he'd told the liaison. Now the law answers back. The hearing opened with House Speaker Mike Johnson presiding. He didn't waste time. This session is convened to address the defiance of federal law by elected officials, beginning with the events in Newark. Tom was first to testify. He rose without paper. This isn't about politics, he said, voice even. This is about a mayor who led an illegal breach of federal property and encouraged assault on officers of the United States. He let the silence work. 3 warnings were issued. 3 were ignored. The breach was documented from multiple angles. Then came the assault. And then, he paused, came the symbolism. Screens behind him lit up with the image Ras Baraka mid-stomp crushing the subpoena. Let me be clear, Tom continued. He didn't destroy a piece of paper. He destroyed the premise that no one is above the law. Whispers rippled through the chamber. Cameras zoomed in. The press pool scribbled. The next clip rolled Maceiver shoving an ICE officer, swinging her handbag like a warhammer, screaming live to her followers. She called it protest, Tom said. We call it a felony. Letitia James's name was next. A second screen flicked on, showing internal memos redacted, encrypted, and then decoded. Pam Bondi stepped up. These communications indicate strategic interference with immigration enforcement in New York, she said, sliding the documents across the table. Selective prosecution, suppression of ICE warrants, and in one case, destruction of internal tracking data. Letitia's attorney objected. This is a political witch hunt. Mike Johnson overruled him. Pam continued. The DOJ is not here for politics. We are here for accountability. A badge is not a shield from the law. Tom leaned forward again. This wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Timed, rehearsed, streamed, designed to provoke and defy. Baraka, now in D.C., under supervision, sat stone-faced at the witness table. His mic was live. I stood up for my city, he said. Not for ICE, not for tyranny. You stood on federal ground and declared rebellion, Tom replied. A beat. Pam Bondi opened her folder. Pursuant to Title 18, Sections 111 and 1507, the Department of Justice formally charges Mayor Ras J. Baraka with criminal trespass, obstruction, and contempt of Congress. Click. The folder closed. The chamber was still. Baraka didn't speak. Maceiver sat next to him, arms folded, lips pressed. Cameras froze. Reporters leaned forward, waiting for a reaction. None came. Tom turned to the committee. We didn't seek this confrontation. They brought it to us, and now we answer. A pause. Then the gavel came down. We will reconvene tomorrow at 8:30. Testimony from federal ICE officers will follow. Tom stepped back from the mic. Justice had started. And it wouldn't stop here. At precisely 8:30 a.m., the hearing room filled again. The room was sharper this time, quieter. The kind of quiet that meant witnesses were coming. First up, Special Agent Marcus Reeve, ICE veteran. He walked in uniformed and unshaken, sworn in, sat straight. Described the events at the Delaney facility, Johnson instructed. Reeve didn't dramatize. We issued 3 lawful orders to disperse, all ignored. Officer Ramirez was assaulted by Congresswoman Masiver. His vest absorbed the blow, but he was bruised and later treated for a concussion. The incident was captured on 3 separate devices, including the officer's body cam. A screen lit up. The impact played on loop. Gasps broke out. Did the officer retaliate? No, sir. He followed federal use of force protocols. Tom Homan watched silently. The room was on edge not because the evidence was shocking, but because it was inescapable. Reeve continued. Mayor Baraka led the crowd onto ICE-controlled land. He dismissed orders and engaged in verbal threats. His actions emboldened unlawful entry. Pam Bondi leaned in. Was there any resistance from federal agents during the arrest? None. The response was measured, peaceful, and documented. Next, another witness, Maria Ochoa, a DHS analyst. She wore dark glasses, spoke with calm. Our intelligence monitoring systems intercepted encrypted planning messages between organizers tied to Baraka's office and activist cells in Philadelphia. They choreographed the timing of the breach to align with national media coverage. Tom nodded slightly. Proof it wasn't spontaneous, he whispered. The chairman pressed. What kind of coordination are we talking about? Maria tapped her tablet. They used a layered broadcast strategy. Masiver's live stream reached 2.7 million views within 4 hours. They had signage, pre-printed narrative points coordinated, and media feeds staged. Mike Johnson leaned back. So what we witnessed wasn't civil disobedience, it was theater. Maria said nothing. She didn't need to. A hush fell as Letitia James was summoned. The New York Attorney General entered the room in gray. Not defiant, not meek, just calculated. Her counsel sat beside her. She was sworn in. Ms. James began Johnson. Why did your office choose not to honor ICE detainers for over 600 cases involving known immigration violators? She inhaled. Because ICE's enforcement in New York was politically motivated and structurally biased. We were protecting our judicial sovereignty. Pam Bondi stood. That's not legal grounds, that's political rationalization. Letitia raised her voice slightly. We do not exist to rubber stamp federal overreach. Tom stepped forward. No, you exist to uphold the law, not interpret it selectively. He held up a document ICE detainer log stamped and rejected with boilerplate denials. These rejections weren't case-based. They were blanket dismissals. Letitia remained stone-faced. Tom continued. 2 of those released went on to commit violent offenses. One involved the stabbing of a federal witness. Gasps. Some in the gallery covered their mouths. Do you still call that sovereignty? Letitia responded. I call that tragic, not criminal, Mike Johnson pressed. Ms. James, were you or any member of your staff in contact with Baraka's office before or during the Newark incident? A long pause, then no direct contact. Pam Bondi slid forward a printed transcript. The committee possesses evidence of indirect communication through encrypted channels between legal advisors from your office and protest coordinators in Newark. Do you deny this? Letitia paused again. I have no knowledge of that, she said flatly. The room tensed. Outside news alerts exploded. James denies encrypted ties to Newark uprising. DHS presents explosive testimony. Masiver video hits 5 million views. Inside, Tom remained centered. He turned to Johnson. Let's not allow this to be lost in drama. Let's remember what happened. An elected official stomped on a subpoena, a congresswoman struck a federal officer, and a state AG may have colluded to block federal law. These aren't hypotheticals, they're charges. Johnson nodded. Final witness for the day, he said. Officer Ramirez. The man entered in a neck brace. The room quieted. He took the oath. Looked up, jaw set. Did you feel provoked? Officer Johnson asked. Yes, but I also felt filmed, and I knew if I reacted it wouldn't be a defense. It'd be fuel. And what did you feel when Congresswoman Maciver hit you? Nothing, he said. Not pain, just confirmation. Confirmation that this wasn't about protest. It was about performance. Silence. Pam Bondi stood. Tomorrow we will issue formal recommendations. Johnson closed his folder, and we vote on whether this becomes a federal referral. The hearing was adjourned, but the reckoning had only begun. The next morning, the air inside the Rayburn hearing chamber was noticeably heavier. It wasn't tension, it was certainty. Today wouldn't be about gathering information. Today was about drawing lines. The room filled earlier than scheduled. Members of Congress showed up with annotated folders and legal aids in tow. Tom Homan stood by the window watching the sunrise cut through the marble lines of the Capitol. Next to him, Pam Bondi reviewed her final statement, sharp, precise, and devastating. "Are we ready?" she asked. "We were ready the moment Baraka stomped on that subpoena," Tom replied. At 9:00 a.m., Mike Johnson brought the hearing to order. "Yesterday, we heard testimony from officers, analysts, and accused officials. Today, we move into formal deliberation. But before we do, we will review the sequence of violations and legal context." The first screen lit up. A timeline appeared May 8, 11:03 a.m. to 4:17 p.m., split-second precision. 3 warnings, 2 assaults, 1 unlawful breach. Tom stood. "Let me walk you through the timeline that led to this chamber." He pointed to the first frame. "This is the initial notice given to Baraka, read aloud, documented, and delivered by hand." Click. The next slide showed Baraka waving it off with a smirk. Second notice ignored. Third notice torn and thrown to the grass. Click. Then the breach. And then the act of contempt, a subpoena stomped into the pavement while he shouted, "Bury ICE with me." Mike Johnson's voice cut in. "This is no longer about personal ideology. This is about public defiance of federal authority." Pam Bondi took the podium. "Under Title 18, we now consider the totality of the act's criminal trespass, obstruction of law enforcement, and willful defiance of congressional authority." She turned toward the defense table. "Mayor Baraka, do you wish to speak?" Baraka stood, calm, controlled. "This hearing is the latest act in a long play of political retaliation. You treat resistance as rebellion and protest as felony." Pam raised an eyebrow. "Do you deny stepping onto federal property after 3 warnings? I don't deny being there. I deny that it was a crime. Do you deny encouraging your supporters to join you? I encourage them to witness injustice." Click. The screen behind them flickered Baraka, waving people forward, cameras rolling. "Do you deny destroying a congressional subpoena in defiance?" Baraka hesitated. "I rejected it. Publicly." Tom Homan rose. "You didn't reject it. You stomped on it. That distinction matters here." Baraka smirked, then fell silent. Letitia James was next. "You have the right to remain silent," Johnson said, "but the committee has specific questions." Letitia nodded. "I will answer. Did your office communicate indirectly with organizers of the Newark incident not knowingly? Were your policies designed to frustrate federal enforcement?" "They were designed to protect due process," Tom interjected. 2 ICE fugitives released under your policy committed violent crimes. 1 stabbed a federal cooperating witness." Letitia's voice cracked. "That was not a foreseeable consequence," Pam countered, "but it was an avoidable one." Another screen came on a document dump annotated with redacted messaging between legal teams and organizers. Encryption logs, IP tracking, coordinated timestamps. Johnson leaned forward. "We are looking at evidence of subversion of federal enforcement." Letitia stared at the floor. The hearing paused for deliberation. 20 minutes later, the committee reconvened. Mike Johnson stood. "This chamber now moves to formal recommendation." Pam read aloud. Letitia James referred for investigation for obstruction of federal process and potential conspiracy to frustrate lawful enforcement. L. Monica Masiver referred for federal assault obstruction and incitement of illegal action on federal property. Ross J. Baraka referred for contempt of Congress, federal trespassing, incitement, and obstruction. Gasps. Cameras clicked. Tom stepped forward, voice low but clear. "This isn't vengeance. This is preservation. If we let one mayor become law-proof, then no border, no court order, and no agency is safe." Johnson brought down the gavel. "The Department of Justice has its referrals. Our role is complete. Now the law must take its course." Outside the streets of D.C. rumbled not with violence but with reactions. Protesters and supporters clashed in front of the Capitol steps. Cable news shows broke programming. Editorials were already being written. Inside a quiet hallway, Tom Homan met Pam Bondi by the exit. "This will get louder," she said. "It's supposed to," he replied. "Truth usually does." The headlines hit before the ink dried on the referrals. By noon, every network had cut into programming. DOJ to investigate, Top New York prosecutor mayor referred to federal court for obstruction. Congress declares open rebellion from within. But Tom Homan didn't watch the coverage. He had a meeting. In a secure conference room within the Eisenhower Executive Office building, he sat across from Homeland Security Secretary Elena Frey and acting White House counsel Harris Dunn. "What you started yesterday triggered a political firestorm," Harris said, arms folded. "I didn't start it," Tom replied. "I documented it." Elena nodded. "The president's standing by it. He's not backing down. But we're expecting coordinated protests in over 30 cities by nightfall." Tom didn't flinch. "Then we brief ICE field offices. No aggression, only enforcement. The law's our armor. We wear it clean." "Do we have legal cover?" Harris asked. Tom turned to a folder on the table. 3 video angles subpoena destruction encrypted communications from a state official's office. "If that's not legal cover, we don't have a republic." Back on the Hill, Pam Bondi met with DOJ prosecutors to finalize the filings. Her language was surgical. "This isn't about Baraka's politics," she said. "It's about his refusal to comply with federal law. Masiver didn't protest, she assaulted. James didn't reform, she obstructed. The indictments were drafted. Federal agents were briefed. Warrant teams stood ready." At 3:47 p.m., Letitia James stepped onto the steps of the New York State Supreme Court to address the press. "This is not justice," she said. "This is retaliation disguised as reform, and I will not be intimidated by federal overreach." But behind her, reporters received live DOJ filings. Her name, the charges, the evidence log. The questions shifted fast. "Ms. James, are you denying encrypted communications occurred? Did your office coordinate with protest planners in Newark? Will you comply with the subpoena issued by the House committee?" She didn't answer. She walked off. Meanwhile, in Newark, Baraka returned to City Hall, not to resume duty, but to address the public. "I told them I would not kneel to federal thugs, and I won't," he shouted to the crowd. "Let them bring indictments. We'll bring a movement." But inside the building, a U.S. Marshal handed his chief of staff a sealed envelope, a federal summons. Court date 10 days. At 5:22 p.m., Masiver posted a defiant livestream. "I'm being criminalized for caring," she said, "for standing up for the voiceless, for being a woman who doesn't obey men with badges." By 6:00 p.m., the DOJ had issued a joint press statement confirming formal charges and an expedited timeline for federal hearings. The temperature in the nation didn't rise. It boiled. Protests erupted in downtown Chicago, Seattle, and Atlanta. Some peaceful, some chaotic. Hashtags flooded the networks. Defy ICE trended beside No One Above the Law. Tom Homan watched it all unfold from a quiet office, sipping coffee files stacked high around him. "We did the right thing," Pam Bondi said, entering without knocking. "I know," Tom said, "but the right thing always wakes up the wrong people." He turned toward the window. "They're going to paint Baraka as a martyr." "He made himself a martyr," Pam corrected. "We just published the truth." In the basement of the DOJ, Alina Habba was preparing for pre-trial motions. Her team had reviewed hours of footage, 600 pages of encrypted logs and testimony transcripts. "There's no room for ambiguity," she told her aides. "We're not arguing policy, we're presenting law. This isn't a referendum, it's an indictment." Her phone buzzed. A message from DHS. Another rally had turned violent in Philadelphia. Bottles thrown, federal vehicles tagged, chants echoing the same words Baraka had screamed, "Burn before we bow." Alina looked up. "Schedule the first hearing for next Tuesday. I want the public to see everything." Outside camera crews lined the steps of every courthouse in the Northeast. By midnight, the storm had gone national. Senators took sides. Civil rights groups filed amicus briefs. ICE issued an internal statement reaffirming lawful protocols. And behind closed doors, members of the House committee received threats. Pam Bondi received a voicemail. "You think you're protecting America. You're just fueling the fire." Tom received a letter, no return address, typed on a manual machine. "If Baraka falls, cities burn." He placed it in a folder. "Evidence," he muttered. The next morning, on the steps of the Capitol, a protester lit a subpoena replica on fire. Dozens cheered. Then the crowd parted as a federal vehicle pulled up. A marshal stepped out. "Is this how it ends?" the protester shouted. "No," the marshal said. "This is how accountability begins." The courthouse in Washington buzzed like a hornet's nest. Helicopters hovered above their engines, humming a steady warning. The sidewalks were blocked off by barricades and uniformed officers. Protesters and media crews tangled just behind the lines, waving signs and snapping images. Inside, courtroom 8D filled with observers and officials alike. No one was neutral anymore. The trial of Ras J. Baraka, L. Monica Masiver, and Letitia James had become a national referendum on the rule of law. Judge Ellison, a sharp-eyed jurist with 30 years on the bench, entered the room with quiet authority. "Bring in the defendants," he said. Baraka entered first, still projecting defiance, dressed in a dark, tailored suit. Masiver followed, jaw-locked eyes scanning the crowd. Letitia James appeared last, slower, solemn, her reputation trailing her like smoke. Alina Habba stood ready at the prosecution's table, her voice as calm as a sharpened blade. "Your Honor," she began, "this is not a trial of ideology. It is a trial of actions. What happened in Newark was not protest. It was planned, coordinated, and executed in defiance of federal authority." She paused, clicking a remote. Screens lit up Baraka waving people forward. Masiver striking an officer. Letitia's encrypted logs. "These aren't opinions," Alina continued. "They are facts. On this footage you will see the Constitution stepped on, literally and figuratively." Baraka's attorney rose. "The mayor was exercising his First Amendment rights not on federal ground," Judge Ellison interrupted. Masiver's lawyer argued political targeting. Letitia James's counsel attempted to redirect attention to her track record, but the evidence stacked higher than rhetoric. The prosecution brought in witnesses, officers, analysts, local journalists who'd caught the Newark breach from rooftops. Each one cemented the timeline, the coordination, the refusal to stand down. Then came the body cam footage again. The jury winced. The nation watching via live stream gasped collectively. Alina's final words hit like steel. They didn't just defy orders. They tested whether the law would blink. And today we must answer. The defense closed with a call for compassion, for political unity, for understanding of civil disobedience. But the chamber wasn't swayed. Not after the videos. Not after the encryption logs. Not after the federal agent's testimony. The jury deliberated for 16 hours across 2 days. On the morning of the third day, the verdicts were read. Guilty Baraka, criminal trespass, obstruction, contempt of Congress. Guilty MacGyver, federal assault, incitement, obstruction. Guilty James, obstruction of justice, unlawful interference with federal process. Sentencing was set for 30 days out. Outside, the protests surged again, but this time muted by the finality of legal closure. Tom Homan stood outside the courthouse, press gathered around. "This was never about ICE," he said. "It was about accountability. The Constitution doesn't bend for hashtags or headlines. Today it stood firm." He turned and walked away, Pam Bondi beside him, briefcases in hand. Letitia James stared ahead as she was led to a vehicle. Her face betrayed nothing. Baraka lowered his head for the first time in days. Masiver looked directly at the camera, whispered, "This isn't over." But for now, it was. Later that night, as lights dimmed in Washington and cities simmered in a strange hush, Tom sat at his desk. He looked at the final transcript, the video clips, the photographs of subpoenas stomped and laws defied. He closed the folder, wrote one sentence on the cover: "Rule of law tested. Survived." Here's the next story. Caroline destroys Joy Behar at The View, MC stunned by God-given sharpness. The bright studio lights of The View cut through the haze of morning like a spotlight in a darkened theater. Joy Behar leaned into her microphone, her sharp, practiced voice filling the studio. Dressed in a deep crimson blazer, her eyes flickered with the kind of confident aggression that comes from decades of dominating a stage. She smirked as the camera zoomed in. "Let's talk about the latest mouthpiece for Trump's chaos," Joy said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Caroline Leavitt, young, ambitious, and completely out of her depth. She's out there spreading misinformation and attacking the free press. Dangerous." The audience, mostly loyal to the show's left-leaning tone, chuckled and clapped. The segment moved on, but the moment had already sparked like a match against dry tinder. Thousands of miles away in Washington, Caroline Leavitt sat in her West Wing office, the early morning light casting long shadows across her polished desk. Her phone buzzed, a dozen notifications from aides and supporters. She swiped through them, eyes narrowing as she landed on a clip of Joy's segment. She hit play, listening to Joy's words cut through the air. She took a slow breath, her jaw tightening. "You want to start a fire, Joy," she muttered. then watch it spread. Without a second thought, Caroline tapped a message into her phone. Book me on The View. Today. The response from her communications director came quickly. Are you sure? Unannounced, Caroline's reply was instant. Absolutely. The black SUV glided through the bustling streets of Manhattan, its tinted windows reflecting the chaos of the city. Caroline sat in the back, scrolling through her prepared notes. She had no intention of walking into an ambush without ammunition. She knew the risks, a hostile crowd, a sharp-tongued panel, the potential for a viral misstep. But she also knew something else. Fear was a language she refused to speak. Back at the studio, the producers scrambled when her team confirmed the visit. "She's coming here!" One of them muttered, eyes wide. The control room buzzed with sudden urgency, camera angles adjusted, microphones checked. Joy paced behind the set, her usual self-assurance tinged with an edge of irritation. She had not expected this. Caroline stepped out of the SUV, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Paparazzi snapped photos as she strode toward the studio entrance, her tailored navy suit and silver cross glinting under the bright morning sun. She didn't slow down, didn't glance back. She was here for a confrontation, not a cameo. The studio's backstage felt like a pressure cooker tension thickening as Caroline's arrival spread through the crew. She moved quickly through the maze of corridors, past gaping interns and anxious producers, and reached the side door to the main stage. She paused for just a heartbeat, fingers resting on the cool metal handle. The red light above the door blinked. Live. She pushed the door open and stepped onto the stage. The studio fell silent, the audience's murmurs cut off like a radio snapped off mid-sentence. Joy, mid-monologue, froze her mouth hanging open. The camera cut to her eyes wide, caught without her script. Caroline walked straight toward the host table's shoulders, back eyes locked on Joy. She didn't break stride. She didn't blink. "Miss Behar," she said, her voice cutting through the studio like a blade through fog, "if you're going to accuse someone of spreading lies, at least have the courage to say it to their face." A hush fell over the room, the kind of silence that only happens when the script goes out the window. Cameras zoomed in, audience members leaned forward, producers whispered frantically into headsets. Joy's eyes narrowed, her polished facade cracking just a bit. She forced a tight smile, trying to regain control. "Caroline, this is my show," she snapped. "You don't just walk in here uninvited." Caroline didn't flinch. She placed her hands on the edge of the host table, leaning in just enough to close the distance. "Maybe if you didn't make a habit of attacking people who aren't present to defend themselves, I wouldn't have to." The audience gasped, a ripple of shock and anticipation spreading through the room. Joy's fingers tightened around her mug, the faint clink of ceramic against her manicured nails audible in the charged silence. "You want to talk about threats to democracy?" Caroline continued, her voice steady, each word deliberate. "Let's start with the truth. You don't get to define me. You don't get to put words in my mouth just because you have a microphone." Joy opened her mouth to respond, but the camera cut to Caroline, her face framed by the harsh studio light's eyes locked on her opponent. She wasn't backing down, and everyone watching could feel it. The battle had begun. The lights blazed overhead, cutting through the cool air of the studio as Caroline Levitt stepped out of her black SUV and into the waiting chaos. Camera lenses clicked in rapid succession, reporters shouted questions, and the hum of electrical equipment created a constant background buzz. The sleek glass doors of the studio reflected her sharp navy blazer, the silver cross on her lapel catching the light as she strode forward with purpose. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Producers whispered into headsets, stage managers gestured frantically, and the makeup team did last-minute touch-ups on the host as they prepared for the live broadcast. Joy Behar was already seated at the round table, her lips pursed, eyes narrowed, and fingers drumming against the table's polished surface. She had heard the rumors. Caroline was coming back, uninvited, unapologetic, and ready for a fight. Caroline's heels echoed against the polished floor as she made her way through the labyrinth of corridors past rushing interns and wide-eyed staffers. She felt the heat of the studio lights before she even reached the stage, the air heavy with anticipation. Backstage, a junior producer tried to intercept her. "Miss Levitt, you can't just—" "I'm not here for permission," Caroline cut in, her voice sharp, her eyes unflinching. She brushed past him, pushing open the door that led to the set. The chatter died down. The cameras were rolling. She didn't pause, didn't flinch, her gaze locked on the host table. Joy's head snapped up. The other hosts exchanged quick, wide-eyed glances. The audience murmured, some leaning forward in their seats, others pulling out their phones to capture the unexpected confrontation. Caroline reached the edge of the stage, the bright lights casting long shadows behind her, and stepped into the spotlight. Miss Behar, Caroline said, her voice clear, cutting through the studio like a knife through silk. You said I was dangerous. You said I was dishonest. You said I was a threat to democracy. She took another step forward, the click of her heels sharp against the polished floor. Well, here I am. Say it to my face. Joy's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightened, but she didn't back down. She leaned forward, elbows on the table, fingers intertwined. You walk into my house, she shot back, her voice dripping with disdain, and expect me to apologize. Caroline's smile was thin, her eyes cold. I don't expect anything from you, Joy, except the truth. The room fell into a tense silence. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, their red lights blinking in anticipation. One of the co-hosts shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing nervously between Joy and Caroline. Joy leaned back, her eyes flicking to the control booth where producers were frantically signaling for a commercial break. She ignored them, her focus locked on the young woman standing defiantly before her. Truth! Joy scoffed, leaning back in her chair, crossing her arms. The truth is, you're a puppet, Caroline. A mouthpiece for a man who's turned this country upside down. Caroline's gaze didn't waver. And you're a relic clinging to a script, terrified that someone younger, someone hungrier might just take your place. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the audience. The air felt heavier, the room smaller. Caroline took another step forward, her shadow stretching across the table. You want to talk about truth? She continued, her voice steady, deliberate. Then let's talk about facts. You accused me of leaking classified information, of being a danger to democracy. You said it without evidence, without proof, because it fits your narrative. Joy's eyes narrowed further. She opened her mouth to speak, but Caroline cut her off. I came here to set the record straight, to look you in the eye and say, if you're going to attack me, do it with the facts. Not with innuendo, not with smear tactics, not with tired partisan talking points. The audience erupted into a mix of gasps and murmurs. Joy's co-hosts glanced nervously at each other, sensing the shift in the room's energy. Joy's fingers curled tighter around her crossed arms, her knuckles whitening. Caroline paused, letting the silence stretch, then leaned in her voice, dropping to a near whisper, but clear enough for every microphone to catch. You said I was dangerous, Joy? Maybe you're right, but not for the reasons you think. She straightened, stepping back from the table, her gaze still locked on Joy. I'm dangerous because I speak for the people you ignore, the voices you dismiss, the truths you try to silence. That's why I'm here. That's why I walked onto this stage uninvited, unapologetic, and unafraid. With that, she turned her heels, clicking against the polished floor as she walked off, set the audience still buzzing, the cameras still rolling, the tension hanging thick in the air. Backstage, the junior producer who had tried to stop her earlier stared wide-eyed as she passed. Caroline didn't break stride. She had said what she came to say, and the echoes of her words still rang in the air. As she stepped back into the cool air outside the studio, the first text from her communications director popped up on her phone. Trending nar1, you did it. Caroline allowed herself a small, satisfied smile before slipping her phone back into her pocket. The battle was far from over, but for now she had won this round. As the stage lights cast a soft glow over the polished floors of the studio, the atmosphere felt charged attention that clung to the air like static before a storm. Caroline Leavitt sat in her dressing room, a thin strip of LED lights reflecting off the sleek navy blue blazer she had chosen for this encounter. She leaned in closer to the mirror, adjusting the small silver cross necklace that rested just above her collarbone, a quiet but deliberate statement of faith and resolve. She glanced at the clock, 10:02 a.m., 2 minutes past the segment's start time. She could hear the muffled hum of the studio audience through the walls, a low rumble of anticipation mixed with scattered applause. She straightened, took a deep breath, and replayed Joy Behar's words in her mind, letting the sting of those accusations fuel her focus. Unqualified, dangerous, threat to democracy. Caroline's jaw tightened. She had built a career on being underestimated, on pushing back against the narratives others tried to define her with. Today would be no different. She wouldn't just defend herself. She would own the stage. The door cracked open, and her assistant poked his head in. We're on in one, he said, his tone a mix of caution and encouragement. She met his eyes in the mirror, offering a brief, confident nod. Then, with a final glance at her reflection, calm, composed eyes sharp, she rose and walked out. The hallway to the studio felt narrower today, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to witness the coming clash. Every step echoed, heels clicking like a countdown. She passed a crew member who quickly averted his gaze, a nervous flicker of recognition flashing across his face. She pushed through the double doors and entered the green room, where a producer handed her a mic without making eye contact. She took it, clipped it to her lapel, and then the stage door. She placed her hand on the handle, felt the cold metal against her palm, and exhaled slowly. The moment she pushed it open, the noise hit her. Applause chatter, the bright, overproduced energy of daytime television. As she stepped onto the set, every head turned. Joy Behar, seated at the far end of the curved table, stiffened her smile, slipping for a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. Caroline didn't miss it. The stage lights intensified, making the air feel sharper, hotter. She walked with purpose to the empty chair set beside the host, ignoring the whispers and darting glances from the crew. She placed both hands on the back of the chair, locking eyes with joy before even sitting down. Ladies and gentlemen, the lead host announced, her voice a practiced blend of cheer and caution. Joining us today, live and uninvited, is Caroline Levitt. Scattered applause, a few polite claps mixed with murmurs. Caroline smiled, a tight, controlled expression that revealed nothing of the fire simmering beneath. "Thank you for having me," she said, her voice steady, cutting cleanly through the artificial cheer. She took her seat, crossing one leg over the other with deliberate calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I understand there's been a lot said about me here lately. I thought it was only fair to join the conversation." Joy leaned forward, her manicured fingers laced together like a trap ready to spring. "Oh, we weren't expecting you, Caroline," she replied, forcing a smile that never reached her eyes. But I suppose it's brave of you to show up." Caroline met her gaze unflinching. "Brave or necessary, depending on your perspective," she said, smoothly. "I'd hate for the audience to be misled without a chance for a real discussion." The air in the studio tightened. One of the co-hosts shifted in her seat, casting a sideways glance at the teleprompter as if it might offer an escape route. But Caroline wasn't here to play defense. She leaned in, her voice dropping a notch, pulling the audience closer with the weight of her words. "You accused me of leaking classified information," Caroline said, her tone crisp. "On national television, no less." Joy opened her mouth, a flicker of surprise breaking through her polished facade, but Caroline continued, cutting off any attempt at interruption. "You called me dangerous. You said I was a threat to democracy." She let the words hang in the air, the weight of them pressing down on the polished studio floor. "So here I am. Let's talk about it." The audience murmured, a ripple of unease passing through the rows. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of expression. Joy's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing as she prepared to strike back. "Oh, we'll talk, Caroline," she said, leaning back in her chair with a forced chuckle. "But let's start with the facts." Caroline leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, her expression sharpening into something almost predatory. "Please do." The camera lights intensified, the air grew heavier, and for a moment, it felt like the entire studio was holding its breath. The gloves were off. The storm had arrived. The camera lights blazed to life as the show's theme music faded into a low hum. Joy Behar, her signature red glasses perched confidently on her nose, shuffled the papers on her desk, a small smirk playing at the corner of her lips. She leaned into her microphone, ready to launch into her next segment. "All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Now, if you missed our little surprise guest a few weeks back, you might remember the moment Caroline Levitt stormed into our set, uninvited, to deliver one of the most aggressive ambushes this show has ever seen. She adjusted her glasses, leaning back as the audience murmured in anticipation. But today we're going to talk about the fallout, the aftermath of that little drama. Estiu. The studio screens cut to clips of Caroline's unplanned appearance, her stride, firm eyes, sharp voice cutting through the air like a blade. The audience murmured as the highlights played, whispers rippling through the crowd like an approaching storm. Joy watched the screens, her jaw tightening slightly as the scenes replayed. She walked in like a wrecking ball. Joy continued, her tone half mocking, half amused, and walked out as if she'd delivered the Gettysburg Address. But here's the question. What happens when the spotlight fades, when the applause dies down, Is she still the fearless truth teller she claims to be, or just another talking head looking for a soundbite? As the camera cut back to the main table, Joy leaned forward, her fingers steepled in front of her. She knew what she was doing, stoking the embers, reigniting the fire. She wanted a reaction. She needed one. This was her arena, and she wasn't about to let an upstart walk in and claim the crown without a fight. Meanwhile, across the city, Caroline sat in her modest West Wing office, the sunlight streaming through the half-open blinds, casting sharp lines across the polished wood of her desk. She watched the broadcast on her laptop earbuds, and eyes narrowed. Her assistant, Sarah, hovered nearby, phone in hand, the nervous energy almost palpable. "They're baiting you," Sarah whispered, glancing nervously at the screen. "They want you to respond. They're hoping for another viral moment." Caroline leaned back, the leather chair creaking softly beneath her. She removed the earbuds and let out a slow breath, her jaw tightening. "That's the thing about them, Sarah. They don't realize that every time they poke, they just sharpen the blade." Sarah hesitated, her thumb hovering over her phone's screen. "Should we release a statement? Push back?" Caroline's eyes flicked to the framed photo on her desk, her family, her first campaign victory, the American flag fluttering in the background. "No," she said firmly. "Not yet. We don't play by their rules." Outside her office, the usual buzz of West Wing staffers moved like a low, constant hum, the heartbeat of a living, breathing administration. Caroline stood crossed to the window and looked out over the manicured lawns of the White House grounds. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. She was more than just a spokesperson. She was a voice, a fighter. And if Joy wanted a rematch, Caroline would make sure it wasn't just another round. It would be a reckoning. Back at the studio, the segment continued, Joy's voice growing sharper as she leaned into the camera. "Let's be honest," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "It's easy to walk into someone else's house, shout a few lines, and walk out. It's a lot harder to stand on your own 2 feet when the cameras aren't rolling." Caroline's phone buzzed. She glanced down. A text from her comms director. It was short, simple. "She's pushing it. Are you ready?" Caroline smiled. She slipped her phone into her pocket, adjusted the silver cross on her blazer, and stepped out of her office, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floors. The cameras might not be rolling now, but they would be soon enough. "Let them talk," she whispered to herself as she strode down the hallway. "I'll make them listen." The morning sun poured through the windows of Caroline's office, casting long, sharp shadows on the polished floor. She stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the steady stream of staffers below, each one moving with a purpose, a mission. Her phone vibrated on her desk, the screen lighting up with a message from Sarah. "They just aired the clip and it's getting traction." Caroline picked up her phone, swiping open the message thread. She thumbed through the rapidly flowing stream of messages, support from colleagues, a note from her old campaign manager, and even a text from her mother. "Proud of you, honey. Keep fighting." She smiled slightly, the corners of her mouth pulling tight as she tossed the phone back onto the desk. It landed next to a stack of briefing notes, still neatly organized, untouched since the previous night. Her eyes drifted to the framed picture beside it. Her first campaign win, hands raised in victory, the crowd a blur of red, white, and blue. A knock at the door broke her reverie. Sarah stepped in, a tablet clutched to her chest, her face tense but determined. "They're doubling down," she said, closing the door behind her. "Joy's leaning into the narrative that you're a loose cannon, unprofessional, impulsive. She just ran a segment calling you a political puppet. It's getting traction." Caroline's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing slightly as she absorbed the words. She straightened, brushing an imaginary crease from her blazer. "Let them talk," she said quietly. "I'm not here to win their approval. I'm here to change the game." Sarah stepped closer, lowering her voice. "The press team is nervous. They think you should go on air, set the record straight." Caroline turned back to the window, the Washington Monument stark against the blue sky. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'll address it," she said, her voice firm, "but on my terms." Sarah hesitated, her brow furrowing. "You're going to walk back onto that set." Caroline's lips curled into a tight, determined smile. "No, I'm going to invite them into my world. They want a show, I'll give them one." With that, she reached for her phone, her fingers moving swiftly as she typed a short message to her communications team. "Set it up. I want a live interview. No filters. No scripts." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing, simply nodding before slipping back out into the hallway. As the door clicked shut, Caroline moved back to her desk, her fingers brushing the edge of the framed photo. She didn't just want to respond, she wanted to redefine the battlefield. They want to fight. She whispered, her voice steady, resolute. Let's make it a war. In the control rooms of The View, producers watched the numbers climb, viewership up, engagement spiking. But they felt it, the unease, the creeping realization that they might have picked a fight with the wrong woman. And somewhere in the depths of the White House, Caroline Leavitt was preparing to prove them right. The morning after Caroline's message to her comms team, the White House press office buzzed with an electricity rarely felt this side of Pennsylvania Avenue. Staffers moved with a sense of urgency, phones clutched tightly, keyboards clacking as rapid-fire emails shot across screens. Caroline's challenge had been issued and the media machine was already spinning. Caroline stood in her office, her gaze fixed on the window as the first rays of morning sun cut through the blinds, casting long, sharp lines across the polished floor. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool leather of her office chair against her palms as she leaned forward. She knew what was coming, the storm, the spin, the backlash, but she had never been one to flinch in the face of a challenge. The door swung open, and Sarah stepped in a tablet clutched against her chest, eyes bright but anxious. It's live, she said, stepping closer. They took the bait. The View just announced they're airing your segment tomorrow. Caroline allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Good, she said, her tone steady. Let them. Sarah hesitated, glancing down at the tablet's glowing screen. They're framing it as a final showdown, trying to paint you as unstable reactionary. They've already got analysts lined up to pick apart every word you say. Caroline's eyes narrowed slightly, her fingers tapping against the armrest. Let them try, she whispered. They're about to find out what happens when you corner someone who doesn't back down. Later that afternoon, Caroline sat in front of the camera in the White House's media room, the lights bright but steady, the air thick with anticipation. She straightened her blazer, adjusted the silver cross on her collar, and looked directly into the lens as the red recording light blinked to life. Good evening, she began, her voice firm, deliberate. I've heard the noise, the accusations, the labels. They say I'm a puppet, a mouthpiece, a political pawn. But let's get one thing straight. I'm nobody's puppet. I speak my mind, and I back my words with action. She leaned in, her eyes never leaving the camera. To the hosts of The View, to the pundits and commentators who think they know me, you've had your say. Now it's my turn. The feed cut to a pre-recorded segment. Caroline on the campaign trail meeting with voters standing at the podium during White House press briefings, pushing back against hostile questions from the press corps. The images were stark, powerful, a reminder of the fire she brought to every room she entered. When the live feed resumed, Caroline's expression was sharp, her voice edged with controlled fury. I didn't come to Washington to be quiet, to play nice, to wait my turn. I came here to fight. For the people who put me here, for the families who believe in this country, for the truth. She paused, letting the silence fill the room, the only sound the quiet hum of the studio lights. They want to call me reckless fine. I'll own that, because sometimes the only way to break through the noise is to hit back twice as hard. Back at the View studios, producers watched the live feed with a mix of awe and anxiety. Joy sat in her dressing room, eyes narrowed, as she watched Caroline's broadcast on a small monitor. She felt the heat rising, the uncomfortable prickling of someone who had thrown a punch only to realize their opponent had just countered. And harder. As Caroline's segment wrapped, she leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly as the lights dimmed. Sarah slipped back into the room, her tablet still glowing. The response is already coming in. She whispered, her voice tight with barely contained excitement. The clips are trending. You just flipped the script. Caroline glanced at the screen, her own face staring back at her, eyes fierce, jaw set. She stood, slowly feeling the tension leave her shoulders as she straightened her blazer one last time. She had done what she set out to do. She had set the terms, taken control of the narrative, and put The View on notice. As she stepped out of the studio, the whispers of her staffers followed her down the hall. Low, excited, tinged with a hint of awe. Caroline Leavitt hadn't just responded. She had fired the first shot in a war she had no intention of losing. Here's the next story. Caroline Leavitt destroys corrupt Judge Hargrove. His career completely ruined in just 18 months. 250 documented cases of courtroom religious suppression emerged, all linked to one man, former federal judge Charles Hargrove. One woman fined $500 for wearing a hijab. A teenage boy expelled for a Star of David chain. A Catholic teacher dismissed after a prayer. The list was chilling, and it kept growing. Caroline Leavitt, White House press secretary, had once been silenced to fine for a silver cross barely visible at her collar. That single moment, buried on page 117 of a 312-page dossier, triggered a storm. He didn't just target me, Caroline said, eyes cold with focus. He targeted everyone. Linda Martinez, a seasoned investigator, laid the thick black folder on Caroline's desk. Each page detailed a violation of faith under Hargrove's authority. He used judicial power to suppress belief, Caroline stated flatly. Maya Chen, journalist and confidant, dropped a printout on the table. A screen grab from a viral video showed Hargrove sipping red wine in a luxury villa in Geneva. His smirk was unmistakable. Leavitt will never catch me, he taunted. But Caroline wasn't alone. Dr. Elena Vasquez, forensic finance analyst, joined via video. She pulled up encrypted graphs. 6 offshore accounts traced to Hargrove. One funneled over $2, $4 million from anti-faith lobbying groups in the past 3 years. Caroline leaned forward. Do the transactions align with rulings? Yes. 2 massive deposits 1 week before your fine. Jake Torres, her media strategist, was scrolling fast. Socials boiling. Sharks Justice for Faith has 2.1 million hits in 48 hours. Lucas Reed's takedown video, it's everywhere. And the DOJ? Caroline asked. Jake sighed. They want you quiet. Said it's a diplomatic minefield. Caroline's voice dropped. They warned me. Maya tossed another file on the table. Anonymous leak from a Swiss firm. Shows Hargrove ordered deletion of court server logs. Elena recovered partial metadata. He thinks he's safe in exile, but power is not immunity, Caroline said. Linda rolled out a legal map. Interpol is watching, but they want noise, public heat. Let's give it to them, Caroline replied. Jake drafted a post. He fined people for faith. Now he hides. Let's bring him back. Hargrove caught. It caught fire. Within hours, Judge Hargrove caught trended in 10 countries. Federal buildings in D.C., Chicago, and Houston were surrounded by protesters. Some held silver crosses. Others simply held signs, "Faith isn't a crime." Elena traced another $650,000 sent to a Geneva holding company. We suspect it owns the villa. He financed his escape with blood money, Maya muttered. Caroline paused the video frame of Hargrove. Let's make that smirk the last thing he enjoys. At 2 a.m., Caroline huddled with Linda and Maya in a secure room. An email from a former Hargrove aide had arrived. Check drive C. The script files were masked, not deleted. By dawn, Elena cracked it open. Inside 43 emails between Hargrove and Judge Ellen Carver. We must stop Leavitt, remove her platform. One read. That's conspiracy, Linda growled. That's motive, Caroline said. Jake posted again. This isn't politics, it's persecution. Social erupted. A Catholic teacher fined for a rosary. A Muslim woman denied court access. A Sikh boy expelled for his turban. Caroline went live. This isn't about me, it's about all of us. Faith isn't disruptive, it's human. Hargrove silenced belief. Now justice will silence him. 10 million views in 36 hours. Lucas Reed dropped a visual timeline. Courthouse footage, wire transfers, victim stories. Jake read the stats. 3.5 million engagements, nationwide saturation. Linda alerted Interpol. Public support verified. File attached. Request green light. Interpol replied, if evidence holds up in real time, raid authorized. Elena compiled the final dossier, suppression cases, 250 plus financial trail, 6 offshore accounts, conspirator emails, 43 server deletion, confirmed witness leaks. 4. It's all here, Elena confirmed. Caroline touched her cross. Then tomorrow we make history. At 6:47 a.m. Geneva time, under gray skies, black vans rolled toward the lakeside villa. Inside the DC operations room, Caroline stood beside a massive screen. A red GPS dot blinked second floor northwest corner. Elena had cracked it from Hargrove's own encrypted backups. Maya Chen glanced at her phone. Interpol is 2 minutes out. He's in the bedroom packing. Caroline's voice dropped. He's running again. Not this time. Downstairs, Lucas Reed launched a live stream. More than 8 million viewers were tuned in. The caption read, "Justice is coming." In Geneva, a silent command triggered the breach. Interpol agents surged through the wrought iron gates. Security guards were subdued. Glass shattered. Doors flew open. Inside, Charles Hargrove froze. His suitcase was half packed. His laptop buzzed with alerts. Social media had turned. "She's just a press secretary," he growled. But it didn't matter. Power had shifted. "Hands up. Charles Hargrove, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, religious suppression, and destruction of evidence." They cuffed him. Across the Atlantic, cheers erupted. Caroline watched silent, but fierce. Jake fist pumped. Elena nodded solemnly. "We got him," Maya whispered. But Caroline didn't smile. Now comes the hard part, the trial. Hargrove was flown to D.C. under federal protection. Press swarmed the tarmac. His face, once smug, now pale, filled headlines. Lucas Reed's livestream hit 11 million views within hours. Hashtags Chacho Justice for Faith and Hargrove Caught reached trending status across all platforms. Inside the courthouse, the black folder, the infamous 250-case dossier, was copied, verified, and secured under federal lock. Linda Martinez prepped the prosecution team. We hit him with financials, the black file, and the server logs, in that order. Elena finalized forensic reports, each page loaded with dates, bank codes, and decrypted emails. They were airtight. Jake drafted a new campaign. From Geneva to Justice Hargrove Faces the People. He paired it with visuals of Caroline addressing protesters and victims recounting their stories. Caroline prepared her testimony. The fine, the smear, the conspiracy. "Every symbol he trampled will rise against him," she said. Meanwhile, opposition emerged. A few left-leaning outlets painted Caroline as a zealot. The DOJ issued a warning again, advising her to stay quiet. She didn't. She responded with a statement, "Silence is complicity. I will not sit still while justice is on trial." Outside protesters returned. But now they held different signs. "Bring faith to trial. Bring Hargrove to justice." Silver crosses, hijabs, stars of David, all symbols stood together. A surprise came when a coalition of religious leaders, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Sikh, released a joint letter, "We stand with Caroline. Justice must speak." The world watched, and the stage was set. The federal courtroom in Washington, D.C. was packed. Reporters lined the benches. Citizens filled the back rows. A quiet tension hung over the room. Judge Margaret Ellis took the bench at 9:00 a.m. sharp. "Court is now in session," she declared. "United States versus Charles Hargrove." Caroline Leavitt sat beside prosecutor Daniel Harper. Her silver cross glinted under the lights. She clutched the black folder, the dossier of 250 violations, against her chest. Charles Hargrove entered in a tailored suit, but his eyes were hollow. His lead defense attorney, Victor Crane, whispered something. Hargrove gave a slight nod. "Opening statements," Judge Ellis said. Harper stood. "This is not a trial about politics. It is about power abused. It is about one man who systematically suppressed religious expression and covered his tracks with manipulation, corruption, and arrogance." Crane countered, "My client, Judge Hargrove, was upholding court decorum. This is a witch hunt fueled by media outrage and one woman's personal vendetta." The jury listened intently. 9 women, 3 men, ages ranging from 28 to 72, ethnically diverse. 2 wore visible religious symbols. First witness, Linda Martinez. She described in clinical detail how her investigation uncovered the suppression cases. "We found consistent targeting of individuals expressing visible faith, fines, expulsions, terminations, all orchestrated under Judge Hargrove's rulings." Next came Dr. Elena Vasquez. She projected a chart on the courtroom screen. "Here are 6 offshore accounts linked to Judge Hargrove. The deposits correspond exactly with major rulings in his court." She scrolled through timelines. Each one ended with a ruling and a transaction. Crane objected. "Speculation." "Hard data," Elena replied. "All verified." Then came the server deletion logs. Maya Chen introduced the leaked internal emails. "These are from a Swiss law firm." One of Hargrove's own attorneys flagged an effort to destroy case metadata. Harper played the damning audio. Delete everything about Levitt. She's too dangerous. Gasps rippled through the room. Even the court sketch artist paused. Crane tried again. These could be fabricated. Harper responded, "We have digital verification from the DOJ and Interpol." Then Caroline took the stand. She stood tall, clear voice, no theatrics. "He fined me for a silver cross, but I speak for everyone who was silenced." She opened the black folder. A mother fined for a hijab, a Sikh boy suspended for a turban, a teacher fired for a rosary. Each page is a story he tried to erase. The jury flipped through photocopies. Crane approached. "Ms. Leavitt, are you not the White House press secretary? Did you not use your platform to create this storm?" Caroline met his gaze. "I used my voice, because faith isn't a political stunt. It's a human right." At recess outside the courthouse, thousands stood in silence. Religious leaders led interfaith prayers. Lucas Reed streamed live to 22 million viewers. Inside the court resumed. Crane brought forward Judge Ellen Carver via video deposition. "Ms. Carver, did you ever discuss Caroline Levitt with Judge Hargrove?" She hesitated. "Yes, he said she was a threat." "To what? To his control." The defense crumbled. Judge Ellis set closing statements for the next morning. Harper looked to Caroline. "We just need one more nudge." She nodded. Lucas posted a final rally call. "He fined symbols. Let your voice be one. Show up. Speak out. Faith on trial." It exploded. Churches rang bells. Mosques broadcast calls to prayer. Synagogues lit candles. Faith had been silenced. Now it was roaring back. By sunrise, a sea of people surrounded the courthouse. News helicopters hovered. Religious leaders stood shoulder to shoulder. Media outlets broadcast live across continents. The sidewalks were lined with supporters, waving signs, "Justice for Faith, Caroline stands for all and no one above the law." Inside the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Judge Margaret Ellis took her place, her black robe fluttering slightly as she adjusted her seat. She struck her gavel. "We will hear final arguments." Prosecutor Daniel Harper stepped forward. His voice carried authority and clarity. "This court has seen undeniable evidence, 250 verified cases of religious suppression, orchestrated by one-man financial transactions tied directly to those rulings and a trail of destroyed evidence. Judge Charles Hargrove did not uphold the Constitution, he betrayed it." Harper paused. "This is more than corruption. This is systemic abuse of power. And this trial is the first step toward restoring faith in every sense of the word." Crane rose, the once confident defense now brittle. "My client acted within his judicial discretion. This trial has turned into a media circus fueled by emotion and amplified by political hysteria. Ms. Levitt is not on trial here, but her motives must be examined." The jury looked unmoved. Some scribbled notes. Others simply watched Caroline. She sat, still composed, hands folded over the now famous black folder. At 11:32 a.m., the jury was dismissed to deliberate. Outside, the crowd was growing. Lucas Reed's live stream crossed 25 million views. Interfaith choirs sang together on the courthouse steps. A massive cross, menorah, crescent moon, and prayer flags waved in unity. Caroline stepped away for a moment, retreating to a side room. Maya followed. "You okay?" she asked. Caroline nodded. "I'm just trying to stay focused. If he walks..." "He won't," Maya replied. "But even if he does, you've changed the narrative. That's power." Caroline pulled out her phone and opened a message from her mother. "You are the fire they tried to extinguish. Keep burning." She smiled faintly. At 3:18 p.m., the jury returned. Judge Ellis resumed. The room froze. The forewoman, a middle-aged woman in a lavender suit, stood. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Charles Hargrove, guilty on all charges." Silence. Then an eruption. Supporters inside cried out in joy. Outside, the crowd roared. Caroline exhaled slowly, her cross catching the light from a nearby chandelier. Hargrove slumped. Crane put his hand on his client's shoulder, but Hargrove brushed it off. He muttered something under his breath, inaudible to all. Judge Ellis banged her gavel twice. "Order in the court. Sentencing will be held next week. This court recognizes the extraordinary resilience of Ms. Levitt and the American people who supported the pursuit of justice." Caroline stood, nodding politely. Outside, Lucas Reed held his phone high. "He's guilty," he shouted into the camera. The justice system worked today because one woman refused to stay silent. Zay. The hashtags exploded again. Maichar justice for faith. Shrike Caroline won. System on trial. In the press pit, questions flew. Caroline, how do you feel? What's next for your movement? She stepped up to the podium. Her voice was calm but resolute. This wasn't a personal victory. This was a correction, a restoration. Faith belongs in America, not behind closed doors, not in the shadows. That evening, she sat with her team. Linda opened a manila folder. We've started drafting a bill, the Religious Freedom Protection Act, based on the violations from the black folder. Elena added, we have preliminary support in Congress, 3 senators already committed. Caroline nodded. Let's make it federal law that no judge, no system, no agenda can punish someone for believing in something greater than themselves. Maya spoke up. I've been contacted by international outlets, Europe, Canada, even the Middle East. They want to know more. This is global. Caroline looked to the skyline. Then we'll take it global. The following morning, newspapers across the world led with the verdict. Faith on trial, ends in conviction, read the New York Times. Symbol of suppression toppled, said The Guardian. Caroline's cross of courage splashed across the Washington Post. At a vigil that night, thousands gathered. Muslims, Jews, Christians, Buddhists, atheists, together. Caroline took the stage. We did not win because I spoke. We won because we listened to each other. Faith is personal, but freedom is shared, and we'll defend both. The crowd lit candles. The city skyline shimmered. Meanwhile, Hargrove was held under high security. He stared at the TV in a cell, watching himself being led away in cuffs. He didn't speak. For the first time in years, he had nothing to say. In Congress, the Religious Freedom Protection Act was introduced by bipartisan support. Within a week, over 40 representatives had signed on. Caroline was invited to speak at the Capitol. She stood beneath the rotunda. This is about protection, not provocation. About coexistence, not conquest. About faith, not fear. That same day, the DOJ opened formal investigations into Judge Ellen Carver and 3 other judges mentioned in Hargrove's black file. Maya Chen's expose on systemic suppression of religion broke national records. Lucas Reed was invited onto late-night talk shows to discuss activism and digital justice. Caroline returned home to New Hampshire for the first time in months. Her mother met her at the porch. You stood in the fire, she said, hugging her tightly. And I came out brighter, Caroline whispered. Back in D.C., her office walls filled with letters. Children who wore crosses again. Teachers allowed to wear hijabs. Elderly citizens finally speaking about past discrimination. Linda taped a headline to the door. Leavitt's law could redefine religious freedom. Elena looked up from her laptop. Are you ready for the next fight? Caroline smiled. I was born for it. 1 week later, the federal courthouse in D.C. once again buzzed with tension. The sentencing hearing for Charles Hargrove was underway. Protesters and supporters stood outside waving signs, their voices mixing in a chorus of hope and fear. Inside, Caroline Leavitt sat at the front row, her cross necklace gleaming. Judge Ellis entered. The room fell silent. We are here to finalize the sentencing of Judge Charles Hargrove, she began. Mr. Hargrove, you were found guilty of obstructing justice, suppressing religious freedom, and destroying federal evidence. Do you have anything to say before sentencing? Hargrove stood thin and pale. His voice was low. I believed I was protecting the legal system. I was wrong. I regret my actions not just because I was caught, but because I see now the people I hurt. Ellis nodded solemnly. For your actions, this court sentences you to 22 years in federal prison without parole. Justice must not only be done, but seen to be done. Gasps echoed. Caroline closed her eyes, breathing out the weight she carried. Justice, for now, had been served. But the story wasn't over. In the weeks that followed, Caroline became the center of a nationwide movement. Faith leaders from across the spectrum rallied behind her. She was invited to speak at town halls, universities, and churches. Children lined up for her autograph. Survivors of religious suppression wrote letters, some sharing stories they had never told before. On Capitol Hill, the Religious Freedom Protection Act passed in the Senate with a 76-24 vote. President Burke signed it into law under a crowd of cameras. Caroline stood beside him, a symbol of resilience. Meanwhile, backlash brewed. A coalition of secular organizations filed a lawsuit claiming the law favored religion and violated the Establishment Clause. Mainstream media outlets ran op-eds both supporting and attacking Caroline. She became a lightning rod. In a televised interview, she addressed the storm head-on. "This law doesn't elevate faith, it protects expression. Whether you wear a cross or choose not to believe at all, this law defends you." Her approval rating soared. Lucas Reed created a new viral video series, Caroline the Flame, featuring testimonies of citizens whose rights were restored under the new law. The series hit 50 million views globally. Maya Chen published a best-selling book, Crossing the Line, chronicling the rise and fall of Hargrove the Trial and the woman who dared to stand up. International media followed suit. France invited Caroline to speak at the National Assembly. Germany proposed its own version of the RFPA. In Saudi Arabia, a woman who had been arrested for wearing a necklace in public wrote on social media, "Caroline made me brave," but new threats emerged. Anonymous emails warned Caroline to stop speaking. One night, her office was broken into. No items were stolen, but her cross was left on the floor bent. Linda and Elena launched an internal investigation. "They're trying to scare you," Linda said, "but we won't be silenced." Caroline hosted a press conference the next day. "You can threaten me. You can bend my cross, but you won't break it." The crowd roared. Then came the surprise. A federal agent arrived at her office with new evidence, sealed documents from a private firm tied to Hargrove. It included names of 3 more judges and 1 senator linked to systemic suppression. Caroline's team mobilized. Another black file. Another battle. "We thought we climbed Everest," Maya said. "Turns out it was just the first peak." Caroline reviewed the documents, her jaw tightening. "Then we climb higher." Soon after, she appeared before the House Judiciary Committee to present the new evidence. Camera flashes. Murmurs of disbelief. "This isn't over," she said. "Justice is a journey, not a destination." Back in New Hampshire, she visited the church she grew up in. Her mother, Anna, waited inside. They sat in the quiet pews, sunlight streaming through stained glass. "You've changed the world," Anna said. "Not alone," Caroline replied, "but I'll keep walking until it's safer for others to stand still." A young girl approached them. She wore a necklace with a tiny silver cross. "Ms. Levitt," she whispered, "you made me brave." Caroline knelt, smiling. "No, sweetheart, you made yourself brave. I just reminded you." The moment was quiet, yet louder than any speech. 3 months later, Caroline stood at the United Nations addressing delegates from over 100 countries. Her voice, steady and clear, filled the assembly. "Religious freedom is not a privilege. It's a right, and we protect rights with courage, not comfort." Applause followed, slow at first, then thunderous. A flag flew above the building, not of a nation, but of unity. It bore a symbol designed by Lucas, a candle, with beams reaching every direction. Below, protesters and supporters both watched. But one thing was certain: Carolina Levitt had become more than a name. She was a torchbearer. In her private journal that night, she wrote, "They tried to silence a voice. Instead, they ignited a movement. If I fall tomorrow, let someone else carry the flame. The light must never go out." The echoes of Caroline Levitt's United Nations speech had barely faded when a new challenge landed on her desk. An emergency session was called by the World Council on Human Rights, urging global policy leaders to address the abuse of judicial power. Her name appeared first on the panel's guest list. The stakes had evolved. What began as a fight for personal faith was now a blueprint for global reform. Caroline boarded a plane to Geneva, where protests had once erupted over Hargrove's arrest. Now murals of her adorned alley walls, painted by anonymous artists, her silhouette with a burning cross transforming into a torch. Children posed in front of them, proudly clutching prayer beads, crosses, or none-at-all symbols of belief and freedom side by side. Inside the Palais des Nations, she addressed diplomats from over 150 countries. She began simply, "When a judge silences faith, it is not justice, it is fear wearing robes." Thunderous applause broke protocol. After her speech, a confidential dossier landed in her lap. Elena had compiled records of similar judicial overreach in 11 countries. Caroline's expression turned from pride to purpose. "This isn't just my country's shadow," she said to Linda and Maya, who had joined her in Geneva. "It's the world's." Back in D.C., her bill inspired further legislation. A bipartisan committee proposed the Global Justice Exchange Act, an initiative to train judges, monitor freedom-related trials, and fund protection for whistleblowers. Caroline was asked to co-chair. The role came with risk. Extremist factions targeted her in smear campaigns, one even manipulating AI-generated footage of her speaking out of context. But Lucas Reed and his Gen Z army retaliated in real time, releasing side-by-side breakdowns debunking the fakes. "They can distort the frame," Lucas said during a viral livestream, "but not the flame." Caroline watched and silence moved. A month later, she appeared on Capitol Hill to testify, again this time, on tech accountability and misinformation in modern judicial discourse. A senator attempted to paint her as an opportunist. "You've become more than a press secretary. Aren't you worried you're now a political symbol rather than a public servant?" Caroline paused. Her response was steady. "Symbols inspire, Senator. But my work is substance. Justice is my job, not my brand." She walked out to a standing ovation. Then came the unexpected letter from Charles Hargrove. It was handwritten shaky. He had watched her UN speech. It read, "I once believed the law was above belief. But I see now that faith is part of the truth, and without truth there is no justice. I hope you forgive an old man who feared change." Caroline folded the letter, gently tucked it away. She didn't reply. Instead, she returned to New Hampshire. In the town square, the community unveiled a memorial, a circular stone platform engraved with her words, "Justice is not a destination, it is a direction." Surrounding the stone were 250 small lights, each symbolizing a victim from Hargrove's black file. Every year on the anniversary of the trial, they would be lit. A little girl approached Caroline. "Are you the lady who fights bad judges?" Caroline smiled. "I help people find their voices. That's even better." The girl held out a paper she'd drawn, a judge, a candle, and a crowd holding hands. "That's us," the girl said, "and you're the candle." Caroline's eyes watered. The moment went viral. Again. International schools began including her story in civics classes. Religious institutions cited her legacy in homilies and lectures. Major networks released documentaries. The Girl Who Wouldn't Bow aired in 23 languages. Lucas launched a new digital platform, JusticeLight.org, aggregating stories from those empowered by her stand. From students in Cairo to activists in Brazil, the message was clear. Standing up worked. Caroline declined multiple political offers. She had no desire to run for office. "The courtroom is enough," she told CNN, but she accepted a role as special advisor to the Justice Department on religious rights and judicial reform. Her final public speech for the year was held at Lincoln Memorial. The night was crisp. Thousands stood before her, candles in hand. "They tried to break faith with fear, but look around you, our light remains. Each of you, with your stories, with your symbols, have reignited justice." The crowd lifted their candles, silent, radiant. Caroline looked out at the sea of light and whispered to herself, "The flame never fades." In her journal that night, she wrote, "Justice was never about me. It was about the girl too scared to speak, the boy fined for a prayer emblem, the elder stripped of dignity. They gave me courage. I gave it back. The rest was fire." She closed the journal and opened her laptop, writing a proposal to create a permanent Justice and Faith Fellowship under the Department of State One that would connect global youth leaders defending freedom of belief. In the weeks that followed, her inbox overflowed. A boy from Mumbai sent a video thanking her for inspiring his school to overturn a ban on religious headwear. A mother in Poland emailed a photo of her daughter holding a cross in front of Parliament. These stories built something more powerful than any campaign legacy. And still, Caroline remained rooted. Each Sunday, she returned to the community chapel her mother once attended. There, she didn't speak. She listened. To stories, to prayers, to silence. Because in the silence, she remembered what mattered. A flame, one that no wind could ever blow out. But one spring morning, she received a call. A new report from Amnesty International flagged violations in a foreign court system, religious discrimination echoing the early signs of Hargrove's abuses. Caroline read the report in silence, then looked out the window of her modest New Hampshire office. Her reflection met her eyes, not as a hero, as a servant of truth. She picked up her phone, dialing Linda and Maya. "We've done this before," she said quietly. "Let's do it again." And so the flame moved forward again. Months after the memorial ceremony in New Hampshire, Caroline stood in a modest room within the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. She was invited as an independent observer in a new case involving similar judicial abuses, this time in Eastern Europe. The accused a magistrate who had invalidated marriages conducted under minority religious customs. Caroline reviewed the case files late into the night, her cross resting on a stack of documents. A knock interrupted her focus. Maya entered holding up a USB drive. "Footage of the hearing," she said, "and interviews. Victims are scared, but hopeful." Caroline nodded. "They should be, because we're not just watching, we're here to testify with them." Meanwhile, back in D.C., Lucas launched a new campaign titled Flame Forward, targeting youth participation in civic trials across schools and universities. Videos of Caroline's journey played between modules on justice, faith, and media literacy. The impact was global. In South Korea, a student launched a podcast titled Justice Speaks, inspired by her speeches. In Egypt, university debates adopted the Caroline Clause, a standard for human dignity in mock trials. As the Strasbourg hearings unfolded, Caroline submitted a brief outlining parallels between this case and Hargrove's. She cited sections of her own testimony, ensuring the words of victims echoed beyond language barriers. During a recess, a young lawyer from Croatia approached her with tearful eyes. "Your story saved my cousin," she said. "He was expelled for his faith, but now he's fighting back." Caroline embraced her quietly. The world had changed, and still she carried no political title, only her purpose. Back in New Hampshire, the chapel held a vigil on the trial's anniversary. Hundreds attended. Some had flown in from across the world. The 250 lights were joined by 47 more new cases uncovered and resolved thanks to the framework she helped build. Caroline stood at the front, her hands clasped. She didn't speak that night. The stories spoke for themselves. When the candles flickered in the breeze, none went out. Not a single one. Here's the next story. Caroline Leavitt kicked off Michelle Obama. Shocking moment, Michelle just crossed the line. "You're nothing but a loudmouth mouthpiece, Caroline." Michelle snapped her voice, cutting through the studio like a blade. The air in the Fox News studio froze, a sudden heavy silence falling over the room. Even the camera operators hesitated, fingers hovering over their controls. The crowd, which had been murmuring and rustling moments before, stilled, eyes fixed on the two women facing off under the harsh studio lights. The set of America Tonight, Fox News' flagship primetime political show, was packed. The audience, a mix of red and blue, leaned forward in their seats, eyes flicking between the two women seated opposite each other on the sleek glass table. To Michelle Obama's left, the bright, polished network logo gleamed under the spotlight. To Caroline Leavitt's right, a massive American flag rippled on the high-definition LED backdrop. The host, Anderson Myers, a tall, composed figure known for his calm yet probing style, shifted in his seat. He had seen fierce debates before, but the tension in the studio now felt different, heavier, like a summer storm about to break. "Ladies, let's keep this civil," Anderson said, attempting to rein in the spiraling confrontation. His eyes darted between Michelle's tight, controlled expression and Caroline's fiery stare. He knew this wasn't going to be an easy segment. "Civil," Caroline shot back, leaning in her blonde hair, catching the studio lights as she squared her shoulders. "I'm here to talk facts, Anderson. I'm not the one spouting baseless accusations." Michelle's jaw tightened, her polished, composed exterior flickering for a moment. She leaned back, crossing her arms with the grace of someone who had faced countless cameras and critics, but her eyes were sharp, calculating. "Facts," Michelle said, her voice low, a hint of steel slipping through her controlled tone. "You mean the kind of facts your boss fabricates, the kind of facts that twist truth into something unrecognizable." The crowd murmured a few gasps and whispers, breaking the tension like cracks in glass. Caroline's eyes narrowed, her polished, media-trained smile slipping into something harder, more raw. "You want to talk about twisting truth?" Caroline shot back, her hands gripping the edges of the polished table. "Fine. Let's talk about your husband's legacy. Let's talk about the border crisis. He ignored the jobs, lost the American families forgotten. You want to stand there and preach to me about integrity, spare me. Michelle's eyes flicked to the audience, catching the gaze of a few nodding heads. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a measured, deliberate tone, the kind she had used on countless campaign stages. You mean the border crisis your boss made worse with his cruelty, separating families, tearing children from their parents? She shot back, her words slicing through the air. That's not strength, that's chaos. The studio crackled with tension. The camera swung between them, capturing every twitch, every tightened jaw, every clenched fist. Anderson Myers leaned forward, his fingers nervously tracing the edge of his cue cards. All right, let's focus here. Anderson cut in, trying to steer the discussion back to safer ground. We're here to discuss policy, not personal attacks. Personal attacks. Caroline's voice cut through his like a blade. She leaned in, her eyes fixed on Michelle. Tell me, Michelle, where was this outrage when your husband's policies crippled American industries, when middle-class families struggled to put food on their tables while you vacationed in Martha's vineyard? Michelle's composure slipped just a fraction. Her eyes darkened, her chin lifted, and her fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair. We built this country back from the brink, Michelle said, her voice gaining momentum, each word sharper than the last. We brought this economy back from the worst recession since the Great Depression, while your side cheered as corporations gutted American jobs. Caroline's smile returned sharp and defiant. You brought back the economy. The only thing your administration brought back was debt and division. Don't lecture me about recovery when your policies left millions behind. The crowd rumbled again, a mix of cheers and boos echoing through the studio. Anderson raised a hand, his face a tight mask of professional composure, but the thin sheen of sweat on his brow betrayed his unease. All right, he said, his voice a touch sharper. Let's take a breath. We still have an hour of this broadcast left. Let's try to keep this about the issues. Caroline leaned back, folding her arms across her chest, her eyes still locked on Michelle. She had landed the first blow, and she knew it. The cameras captured the scene perfectly. The young, fiery conservative and the poised, battle-hardened political icon, both unyielding, both unwilling to back down. And the crowd. They were leaning in, waiting for the next strike, the next verbal blow, the next crack in the carefully constructed images both women had built around themselves. The air in the studio crackled with tension, every eye locked on the stage, every breath held in anticipation. Then Michelle Obama's voice cut through the atmosphere, sharp and biting, shattering the fragile silence. You're nothing but a political puppet, Caroline, clinging to Trump's coattails like a lifeline. Without him, you're irrelevant. The room froze. The echo of her words seemed to linger in the air, bouncing off the polished studio walls. Even the camera crew exchanged quick, wide-eyed glances. Anderson Cooper, seated in the moderator's chair, blinked momentarily, caught off guard by the sudden escalation. He adjusted his earpiece, the only sound in the stunned silence, before leaning slightly forward, his eyes flicking nervously between the two women. Caroline Leavitt's jaw tightened, a faint, dangerous smile playing at the corner of her lips. She straightened in her chair, her hands tightening around the edges of the polished glass tabletop, as if physically bracing herself for the impact of the next verbal strike. The studio's cool, clinical lighting cast sharp shadows across the room, reflecting off the polished surfaces and capturing every flicker of expression. The set design, deep blues, sleek blacks, and a towering digital backdrop displaying the show's title in bold, unflinching letters, added a layer of drama that only heightened the growing sense of confrontation. Cooper cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the tension. Welcome back to Fox News Tonight, where we have with us today two of the most influential voices in modern American politics, former First Lady Michelle Obama and White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. We're here to discuss the impact of leadership policy and the ongoing challenges facing our nation. Leavitt's eyes never left Michelle's, her gaze unblinking, a silent promise of retaliation hanging in the air. Michelle, you've been very vocal about your criticisms of the current administration. Cooper continued trying to steer the conversation back to a semblance of professionalism. In your recent appearance on The View, you described the Trump administration as divisive and harmful, particularly in the context of immigration and health care. Would you care to elaborate on that? Michelle shifted slightly, her polished, practiced smile slipping back into place. She crossed her legs, leaned back in her chair, and exhaled slowly as if resetting her composure. Her voice when it came was steady, controlled, the tone of someone who had sparred in the political arena for decades. I stand by my words, Anderson. Michelle began, her tone measured. The Trump administration's policies have torn this country apart. The rhetoric, the fear-mongering, the divisive tactics, they're designed to pit Americans against each other. And people like Caroline here are the mouthpieces for that chaos. Leavitt's smile sharpened, her grip on the table easing as she prepared to respond. She tilted her head slightly, a calculated gesture that conveyed both confidence and defiance. With all due respect, Michelle Caroline cut in, her voice crisp and cutting, you talk about chaos. But let's not pretend that the Obama administration was some era of harmony. Under your husband's watch, economic growth stagnated, middle-class jobs evaporated, and foreign adversaries grew bolder. That's the legacy you left behind. Michelle's eyes narrowed, the controlled mask slipping for a fraction of a second. At least we didn't lead with fear and division. We believed in unity. Caroline leaned forward, her eyes flashing. Unity. You mean like the chaos on the southern border, like the racial tensions that exploded across this country under your watch. Don't preach unity when your policies planted the seeds of division. The studio lights seemed to burn brighter as the two women locked eyes, neither willing to yield. Cooper shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the brewing storm, but unable to steer the conversation back onto safer ground. Michelle drew a deep breath, her jaw setting, the polished veneer of her public persona showing cracks. She straightened her shoulders, back eyes locked on Caroline. You're young, Caroline, ambitious, but you're also dangerously naive if you think this country can survive on sound bites and bravado. Leadership demands more than just echoing a man's talking points. Leavitt didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of the lips that conveyed a sense of control, of confidence that bordered on defiance. I'm not just echoing talking points, Michelle, she said, her voice lowering but gaining a dangerous edge. I'm here to set the record straight. You want to talk about leadership? Let's talk about actions, not just words. Trump's administration rebuilt this economy, created jobs, and put America first. You can try to dismiss that, but the facts don't lie. Michelle opened her mouth to respond, but Caroline wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper, each word slicing through the air like a blade. And for the record, she added, her eyes locking onto Michelle's, I don't cling to anyone's coattails. I make my own path. And unlike you, I don't need a husband's legacy to define me. The studio fell into a deep, echoing silence. Even Cooper seemed to hold his breath, his hands gripping the edge of his notes as if bracing for the impact of the verbal bombs being thrown. Michelle's lips tightened, her hands clenching briefly in her lap before she forced herself to relax, her polished, controlled exterior slipping back into place. But the damage was done. Caroline had landed a direct hit, and everyone in the room knew it. Cooper cleared his throat again, his voice unsteady as he tried to regain control of the show. All right, we'll take a quick break and return with more from our guests. Stay tuned. As the camera's red light blinked off, the silence remained thick and charged like the air before a storm. The camera panned back to Caroline, her jaw set, eyes sharp as steel. She leaned forward, fingertips brushing the table, voice low but electric. You want to talk about fake Michelle? Let's talk about your so-called legacy. Michelle's eyes flashed, the polished calm slipping just a fraction. The studio air grew thick like the moments before a summer storm. Anderson Cooper glanced nervously between them, feeling the tension spike. He cleared his throat, ready to step in, but Caroline's voice sliced through the air, sharp and unwavering. You and your husband promised hope but left behind division. You call Trump a divider, but it was your administration that sowed chaos, weakened borders, and doubled the national debt. You want to talk about families? Your policies forced millions into poverty. So spare me the lecture on compassion. Michelle straightened her jaw, tightening, the calm mask slipping further. Is that so? She replied, her tone icy. And what has your hero done? He built a wall that didn't stop anything but compassion. He bullied allies and coddled tyrants. If that's leadership, then God help this country. The audience held its breath, the hum of the studio light suddenly deafening. Anderson, ever the professional, leaned in, trying to regain control. All right, let's bring this back to the issues. Michelle, you've spoken about unity and compassion. Caroline, you've raised economic points. Let's stick to that. Caroline didn't miss a beat. Unity. You mean like the riots under your watch, like the streets burning in 2014 or the cities that bled while you sat in the White House throwing fancy dinners and writing memoirs. A low rumble rippled through the crowd. Michelle's eyes narrowed, her polished exterior cracking like glass under pressure. She leaned in, her voice dropping an octave. You think you know the first thing about leadership? About the weight of real responsibility? I watched my husband hold this country together while people like you tried to tear it apart with lies and cheap slogans. Caroline leaned back, folding her arms. And yet here we are in a stronger economy, lower unemployment, and a border that isn't just a line in the sand. You call that chaos? I call it progress. Anderson's cue card trembled slightly in his hand. He cleared his throat, voice tight. All right, let's move on to the next topic. But Caroline pushed forward, voice rising. No, let's not move on. Let's talk about the jobs that came back, the factories that reopened, the communities that found their voice again after years of being told they didn't matter. Michelle's lips pressed into a thin line. And at what cost? Alienated allies, shattered diplomacy, families broken apart at the border. You can wave your flag all you want, but don't pretend it hasn't come at a price. Caroline's eyes flared, a hint of a smile curling at the edges. At least we're waving the flag, Michelle. At least we still believe in America first instead of apologizing for it. The studio fell silent. Even Anderson hesitated, his polished TV smile slipping just for a heartbeat. He felt the shift in the room, the energy crackling like live wires. This was no longer an interview. It was a battleground. Michelle exhaled sharply, leaning back in her chair, eyes locking with Caroline's. The gloves were off, she could feel it, and from the fire in Caroline's eyes, she knew this battle was just heating up. The tension in the studio had transformed into something sharper, more dangerous. Anderson Cooper, usually the master of keeping a panel in line, felt control slipping through his fingers like sand. He shuffled his notes, eyes darting between Michelle and Caroline, but the two women were locked in a verbal duel, neither willing to break eye contact. Michelle leaned forward, her fingers pressed together like a steeple. You call yourselves patriots, but what you really are is a cult, she said, voice like cold steel. The audience collectively inhaled. It was the kind of line that could turn a heated debate into an all-out brawl. Blind loyalty to a man who's broken every rule of decency, every standard of respect. You call that leadership? Caroline's eyes narrowed, a flicker of a smile curving her lips. She leaned in, elbows on the table, eyes gleaming. You want to talk about respect? Let's talk about using the IRS to target political enemies. Let's talk about spying on journalists, about a healthcare system that collapsed under its own promises. Don't preach to me about decency. Michelle's jaw tightened, her polished calm giving way to a flash of genuine anger. She straightened chin, lifting eyes fierce. At least we tried to lift people up. At least we didn't spend our time tearing down every institution, every ally, every principle this country stands for. Lift people up? Caroline's laugh was sharp cutting. You left the middle class in shambles, pushed jobs overseas, and doubled the national debt. You threw stones from your ivory tower, and now you want to lecture us about principles. The crowd stirred murmurs, rippling through the studio. Anderson tried to regain control, his professional mask slipping into genuine concern. All right, let's bring this back. But Michelle wasn't done. She leaned closer, her eyes locked on Caroline's, her voice a slow, measured blade. You wrap yourself in the flag, Caroline, but it's just a shield. A way to cover the fact that your party's policies favor the wealthy, the powerful, the ones who already have more than enough. You pretend to speak for the forgotten, but it's all a con. Caroline's eyes flashed, her jaw clenching. And you pretend to be the voice of the people, but you've spent more time on private jets and luxury book tours than in the neighborhoods you claim to represent. Spare me the sanctimony. The tension was now a tangible thing, a coiled spring ready to snap. Anderson leaned forward, his voice urgent. Ladies, please, we're here to discuss the issues. But the two women ignored him, their focus locked voices sharp enough to cut glass. You think I don't care about this country? Michelle shot back, her voice rising, eyes blazing. I spent 8 years in a pressure cooker trying to make real change while facing the kind of hate and lies you can't even imagine. Oh, I can imagine, Caroline fired back, because I live it every day. Every time I walk into a studio like this, I know half the people here want to see me fail, but that's the difference, Michelle. I thrive on it. A sharp silence fell over the studio. Even the cameraman had stopped moving their lenses fixed on the two women. Anderson, his cue cards forgotten, glanced nervously at his producer, who was frantically gesturing for a commercial break. But Michelle leaned back, folding her hands together, her expression shifting from anger to something colder, more calculating. She took a breath, her gaze never leaving Caroline's. You want to play this game, fine, but remember, the higher you climb, the further you have to fall. Caroline's lips parted, a hint of a retort forming, but the studio light suddenly dimmed the commercial break music swelling over the speakers. Anderson exhaled in relief, his shoulders dropping, his microphone still live as he muttered, "We'll be right back." As the cameras cut to commercial, the studio erupted into a controlled chaos. Producers swarmed the stage crew members, whispered into headsets, and makeup artists darted forward to blot the sweat from both women's foreheads. But even as the chaos swirled around them, Michelle and Caroline remained locked in their silent standoff, eyes blazing, hearts racing, neither willing to back down. The real battle was just beginning. As the studio lights flickered back on, the tension in the room had crystallized into something electric, almost combustible. Anderson Cooper, leaning forward, his hands clasped tightly together, knew he had lost control of the interview. But that didn't seem to matter anymore. This wasn't just television now. It was a battleground. Michelle Obama leaned back in her chair, a small, tight smile on her lips, her eyes locked on Caroline Leavitt like a hawk circling prey. She had decided to go for the jugular. You know what the difference is between us? Caroline, Michelle's voice cut through the low hum of cameras and whispered instructions from the control room. I built my legacy on actual service. You built yours on outrage, on noise. You're a glorified provocateur, not a leader. The audience, a mix of curiosity and simmering tension, held its collective breath. Caroline's eyes narrowed, her hands resting on the table, fingers splayed as if ready to push back. Outrage? Caroline's voice was steady but edged with steel. Outrage is watching my generation get buried under debt, watching American cities crumble while politicians like you lecture us about dignity and unity from your gated communities. That's real outrage. Michelle's smile tightened, the lines around her eyes hardening. You think you have the monopoly on frustration? Please, I've spent decades being told to smile, to soften my words, to play nice, while the media picked apart every aspect of my life. And yet, Caroline shot back, leaning in her eyes bright with defiance, you've never hesitated to tear down those who disagree with you. You preach about unity while calling half the country irredeemable. Anderson cleared his throat, his eyes darting between the two women. He could feel the control slipping further, the conversation veering into dangerous personal territory. But the two women seemed oblivious, locked in a duel neither was willing to end. You want to talk about unity. Michelle's voice was sharper now, the polished veneer giving way to something raw and unfiltered. I've seen unity. I've lived it. But what you and your kind are selling is division. It's fear dressed up as patriotism. Caroline's fingers curled into fists. Patriotism. You talk about patriotism like it's a fashion choice, like you can put it on when it suits your narrative and toss it aside when it doesn't. But real patriotism is about more than just words. It's about sacrifice. It's about standing up for the people who don't have a voice. Michelle's eyes narrowed, her tone dropping to a near whisper, the kind that carries more weight than a shout. Don't lecture me about sacrifice. You don't know the meaning of the word. The studio fell into a heavy silence, the kind that pulls all the air from the room. Anderson leaned back, his fingers tapping nervously against his cue cards. This was no longer an interview, it was a confrontation. Oh, I know sacrifice, Caroline said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. I know what it's like to be ridiculed, to be dismissed, to be labeled as a problem simply for standing up for what I believe in. Don't pretend your struggles are unique. Michelle's eyes flashed, her jaw tightening, but she said nothing. The control room's red light blinked, signaling that they were about to cut to another break, but neither woman moved. They were frozen in their silent clash, their words hanging in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Finally, Anderson leaned in, his voice low and strained, almost pleading. We'll be right back. The camera lights dimmed the studio, falling into a momentary shadow. But even as the makeup artists rushed forward and the producers whispered furiously into their headsets, the real fire on that stage remained unextinguished. It had only just begun. As the stage lights came back up, the studio felt more like a coliseum than a newsroom. The air was thick with the crackling tension of unspoken challenges, the kind that makes every breath feel like a dare. Michelle Obama and Caroline Leavitt sat across from each other, their eyes locked in a silent battle jaw set, each refusing to blink first. Anderson Cooper, caught between the two political titans, cleared his throat, his hand tightening around his cue cards. He glanced at the camera, the red light steady like the eye of a storm. He was supposed to moderate this, but the gloves had come off hours ago, and now he was merely a spectator to a collision of forces beyond his control. "You know, Caroline," Michelle said, leaning back in her chair, her tone smooth but her eyes sharp, "the problem with you and your generation is that you mistake noise for strength. You mistake social media likes for real influence." Caroline's lips curled into a small, unamused smile. "And you mistake institutional power for moral authority," she shot back. "You built a brand on being above the fray, on unity and dignity, but you've spent the last decade dividing people." Michelle's eyes narrowed, her polished calm cracking for a split second. She leaned forward, hands clasped, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Don't talk to me about division. I've watched this country splinter under the weight of cheap populism and reckless rhetoric." And Tori. Caroline leaned in, matching Michelle's intensity. "Reckless. You want to talk about recklessness? How about an administration that doubled the national debt and left American cities crumbling under crime and economic decay? You talk about unity, but you governed through division. You just hid it better." The studio audience was still the air thickening with the kind of anticipation that comes before a thunderclap. Anderson glanced nervously at the control room, where a producer frantically motioned for him to cut to a commercial. But he didn't. He couldn't. The momentum was too raw, too real. "You think you're brave," Michelle continued, her voice rising. "You stand on a stage and shout about patriotism, but you've never had to actually govern. You've never had to make a decision that impacts millions. It's easy to criticize from the sidelines." Caroline's eyes flashed. "I'm not on the sidelines. I'm in the fight every single day, standing up for the people who can't afford to live in gated communities or send their kids to private schools. You talk about sacrifice, but you've been protected by a system that never held you accountable." Michelle leaned back, a bitter smile on her lips. "And you're just another loud voice in a long line of political opportunists exploiting fear for fame." Caroline's response was immediate, her voice slicing through the thick air. "And you're a relic of a bygone era, clinging to relevance in a world that's moved on." The crowd gasped softly, the sharp intake of breath like a collective wince. Anderson leaned in, finally finding his voice. "Ladies, we need to—" But Michelle cut him off, her eyes never leaving Caroline's. "I'm not finished." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "You think you're the future? You're just a moment. A fleeting headline, and when the cameras turn off and the tweets stop, you'll be forgotten." Caroline's face hardened, her eyes locking onto Michelle's. "Then let's make this moment count." She leaned in until their faces were mere inches apart, the studio lights catching the fire in her eyes. "Because history remembers those who stand their ground, not those who play it safe." Anderson, sensing the precarious edge they had reached, cut in quickly. "We'll be right back." And the red light blinked off the studio, falling into an uneasy silence. As the camera operator stepped back and the stage crew moved in to touch up makeup and adjust microphones, Michelle and Caroline remained locked in their silent war eyes, still locked, neither willing to be the first to look away. The battle wasn't over.